in the K-12 arena. However, school choice has grown dramatically in recent years. More than 1 million students are benefiting from private school choice programs, which is about double the number of students from just 3 years ago. Additionally, we've seen a grassroots movement of parent involvement. Decades of research has shown that parental involvement, regardless of socioeconomic status or background, has a strong impact on student achievement and long-term success. It's encouraging to see so many parents get more involved in their school systems, as well as the growth of parent advocacy organizations that support them. Their work has been vital to making schools function better. Turning to higher education, we've seen rampant anti-Semitism and stifling of speech on campuses, fueled by bloated DEI bureaucracies. And America's adversaries are sending billions of foreign funds to schools to manipulate them. All of this has resulted in too many students being told what to think instead of how to think. It's also the case that our higher education financing system is at a critical inflection point. President Biden attempted to spend $1 trillion through executive actions on the federal student loan bailout program alone. Transferring student loan responsibilities onto the backs of taxpayers will not solve the underlying issue that the federal student loan program is irreparably broken. What is needed now, more than ever, are real, lasting reforms that protect both students and taxpayers from debt they can't afford. Our committee has hard work ahead of us to ensure our nation's higher education system remains the crown jewel of the world. We also must address our broken workforce system. We have about 8 million unfilled jobs in our country. So there's clearly a mismatch between the skills our workforce has and the skills our employers need. Unfortunately, the nation's workforce system, authorized under the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA, is failing to fill in the gap. Fortunately, our committee made tremendous strides last Congress in addressing these challenges. A Stronger Workforce for America Act passed the House with strong bipartisan support, and after further negotiations with the Senate last year, was poised for enactment. I want to thank former Chairwoman Virginia Foxx and Ranking Member Bobby Scott for their leadership on that bill, and I look forward to taking it back up in this new Congress. While we have great challenges ahead of us, we also have great opportunities in front of us, and I look forward to working with all of our members to meet these challenges. That process starts today, and I'm excited for the productive conversation we will have with this great panel of witnesses. With that, I yield to my friend and ranking member, Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Chairman Walberg. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for our witnesses for joining us today. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing. I'd like to first start with the elephant in the room, and there is current reporting that President Trump plans to issue an executive order to eliminate critical programs at the Department of Education and call on Congress to eliminate the entire department. But then I'd recall that that's exactly what the Project 2025 said the President should do, said that on page 319 of Project 2025. The irony is not lost on me that we're here to discuss the state of American education while current administration is actively discussing how to dismantle the main federal agency responsible for ensuring safe, quality education for all students. According to polls, the majority of the voters oppose the abolition of the Department of Education, and also know that I and every Democrat will do what we can to ensure that the department continues. Now, the issue on hand is reflected in the latest National Assessment of Educational Progress data. Schools are struggling to make up for lost time in the classroom following the COVID-19 pandemic. Achievement gaps which existed before the pandemic have widened. According to that assessment, math and reading gaps between higher and lower performing students continue to rise. as black students continue to be more than 10 points behind their white peers in all subjects. In 2021, Democrats passed the largest one-time investment in education in the history of the United States in the American Rescue Plan Act to provide schools with resources they needed to reopen classrooms safely and make up for lost time due to the pandemic. Without this investment, we would undoubtedly be in a worse situation today. But the Rescue Plan Act was only a Band-Aid on the larger issue of underfunding in schools, and it is abundantly clear that we need sustained federal investment over time to overcome decades of underfunding. Unfortunately, instead of investing in our children, Republicans are stuck on proposals that only create more challenges for students. Consider that the first education bill we considered this Congress targets, indeed bullies, transgender youth. Also, my Republican colleagues have misrepresented programs intended to expand diversity, equity, and inclusion as the problem in education. Republicans have threatened to ban books, police bathrooms, take away funds from communities that need it most, and simply put, the administration is promoting a warped vision of DEI, discrimination, erasure, and inequity. This all serves to distract Americans so that they will not notice that the privatization of American education systems with taxpayer funds going to private schools, the resegregation of public schools, the erosion of services for students with disabilities, and cuts to student loan program, and distracts from the fact that the price of eggs is going up. While some folks may be hollering about imagined DEI problems, many in the public will fail to notice how the taxpayers' money is being siphoned away from public education and the student loan program to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy and well-connected. And so, Mr. Chairman, we can all agree that every student in this country should have access to safe, welcoming, well-funded learning environment. And that begins with eliminating disparities in education with sustained federal funding. This Congress, Committee Democrats will reintroduce legislation such as the Rebuild America Schools Act, which will make critical investments to repair and rebuild school facilities, particularly in high-need areas. The Equity and Inclusion Enforcement Act, which will restore private right of action for students, parents, and local civil rights groups to bring discrimination claims based on disparate impact under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Strengthened Diversity Act, which will provide resources to states and school districts that want to voluntarily develop schools plans to integrate their schools. We have to take steps to lower the cost of higher education for students and families, and to that end, we'll also reintroduce the Lowering Obstacles to Achievement Now, the LOAN Act, which would lower the cost of college for current and future student borrowers and their families by making critical reforms to the student aid system, including doubling the Pell Grant, improving public service loan forgiveness programs, and making loans more affordable and accessible. Allow me, to that end, to promise my colleagues and students across the country that we will not go along with programs to dismantle our education system. We will fight any attempt to dismantle the department, and so we don't know what the plan will be, but count on our opposition to any plan that will abolish the Department of Education and the programs in it. So to that end, Democrats will always be with the well-being of students, teachers, and parents across the country. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, all members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m., 14 days after the date of this hearing, which is February 19th, 2025. And without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. I'll now turn to the introduction of our witnesses, who we appreciate being here. Our first witness is Ms. Nicole Neely, who is the president of Parents Defending Education in Arlington, Virginia. Welcome. Our next witness is Dr. Preston Cooper, who is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute located in Washington, D.C. Welcome, Mr. Cooper. Our third witness is Mrs. Jana Nelson, who is president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in Washington, D.C. Welcome. And our final witness is Mr. Johnny C. Taylor, Jr., who is president and CEO of the Society for Human Resource Management in Alexandria, Virginia. Welcome. We thank you for all being here today and look forward to your testimony. I would like to remind the witnesses that we have read your written statements, which will appear in our full hearing record. I would ask that you each limit your oral presentation to a 3-minute summary of your written statement. The clock will count down from 3 minutes because the committee members have many questions for you, and we'd like to spend as much time as possible on those questions with your answers. Pursuant to Committee Rule 8D and committee practice, however, we will not cut off your testimony until you go too far. I also would like to remind the witnesses to be aware of their responsibility to provide accurate information to the committee. And so first, I'll recognize Ms. Neely. Welcome.
Chairman Wahlberg, Ranking Member Scott, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for inviting me. My name is Nicole Neely, and I'm president and founder of Parents Defending Education and the executive director of PDE Action. American education is in crisis. For far too long, U.S. schools have focused on everything but educating children. And as last week's NAEP scores have shown, our children are bearing the brunt of these bad decisions. Schools are focused on the wrong priorities. Identity politics permeate districts across America in word and deed. Children are regularly treated differently based on race. Color-conscious pedagogy, which considers colorblindness to be negative, is omnipresent in America's colleges of education. 80 years after Brown v. Board of Education, segregated activities persist in the guise of affinity groups, where students and teachers are included or excluded because of skin color. The diversity industrial complex promotes programs like this, conducting equity audits and hosting professional development trainings. Districts pay DEI consultants millions per year, incentivized by the $1 billion in education grants awarded by the Biden administration over the past 4 years. In the wake of October 7th, anti-Semitism spiked in colleges and K-12 schools alike. From lesson plans about settler colonialism to swastikas on mirrors dismissed as Buddhist religious symbols, districts' lackadaisical response to Jew hatred bore a sharp contrast to the anti-racism fervor following George Floyd's murder. Foreign funding remains problematic. Our investigation into Confucius classrooms found districts around the country with ties to CCP-linked entities, and similar program by the Cutter Foundation also exists. The full scope of foreign influence in K-12 merits investigation and is also a significant problem in higher ed, which the Deterrent Act, I know, tackles head-on. Over the past several years, merit has been sacrificed on the altar of equity. Rather than challenging talented students to strive for greatness, schools are eliminating gifted and talented programs and AP classes so that all students remain at the same level. We are witnessing the Sovietification of American schools in real time. Finally, schools are unsafe. Under the guise of breaking the school-to-prison pipeline, districts have removed school resource officers and moved toward non-punitive restorative justice, making classroom management impossible. Families are treated as the enemy. Trust between families and districts is fractured. Rather than partnering with parents, schools work against them. Families are being shut out of their children's lives. PDE has identified over 1,100 districts around the country, impacting more than 12 million children and counting, with parental exclusion policies, which state that parents don't have a right to know their child's gender at school. Districts shouldn't keep secrets from families. As a country, we spend billions of dollars on mental health for students. So why are schools telling kids that their parents' love is conditional and that maybe it's time to lead a double life? Over the past 4 years, parental rights were routinely disrespected by the federal government. When parents spoke up, they were attacked by the media and DOJ. Through our FOIAs, PDE discovered that the National School Boards Association worked with the Department of Education officials to smear American families. As George Washington Carver said, education is the key to unlock the golden door of freedom. The country's equity experiment has been an unequivocal failure, and it's time to move on. Let's refocus schools on core subjects, prioritizing excellence and creating opportunities for those who work hard. Although battered, the American education system is not beyond repair. But to get things back on track, it's going to take a genuine partnership between families and educators. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Neely. And thank you for setting the standard for 3 minutes. I now recognize Dr. Cooper.
Good morning, Chairman Wahlberg, Ranking Member Scott, and distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the state of post-secondary education and the federal government's role in shaping it. My name is Preston Cooper, and I'm a senior fellow focusing on the economics of higher education at the American Enterprise Institute. Americans are losing confidence in the higher education system. According to the Wall Street Journal, 56% of Americans believe that a four-year college education is no longer worth the cost. This changing sentiment has translated into a 12% drop in college enrollment since 2010. To be sure, higher education can be a great investment for students, but all too often that investment does not pay off. When students pay too much in tuition, or don't learn the skills they need to get a good job, or even fail to complete their degree programs at all, the decision to pursue higher education becomes less of an investment and more of a gamble. The federal government heavily subsidizes higher education programs with little return on investment for students. Between 2018 and 2022, I estimate that at least $37 billion in Pell Grants and $86 billion in federal student loans flowed to degree programs that did not lead to a return on investment for students. When students pay for too much for college, relative to what they earn after leaving school, it becomes harder to pay down their loan balances. Before the pandemic, 11 million borrowers were either in default or delinquent on their debts. Millions more were taking advantage of income-driven repayment, loan forbearance, and other options to reduce or eliminate their monthly payments. These high rates of loan non-payment mean that the Congressional Budget Office expects that taxpayers will lose $223 billion on student loans newly originated between 2025 and 2034, and that's to say nothing of expected losses on outstanding loans. While former President Biden's largely unsuccessful efforts to cancel student loans en masse did little to help matters, the student loan program's problems predate his administration. Fortunately, Congress has a unique opportunity to address many of the long-standing problems in the federal student loan program. The College Cost Reduction Act, introduced last year, takes a three-pronged approach to fixing things: reforming the student loan repayment system, imposing sensible caps on borrowing, and holding colleges accountable for how well they serve students. Post-secondary education in America suffers from high costs, uneven financial value, and a chaotic student loan system that creates more problems than it solves. Addressing these challenges would represent a strong first step toward restoring public confidence in American higher education. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper. I recognize Mrs. Nelson for your
Good morning. Good morning, Chairman Wahlberg, and Ranking Member Scott, and distinguished committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I am Jana Nelson, President and Director Counsel of the Legal Defense Fund. Since our founding 85 years ago by Thurgood Marshall, we have fought to ensure that Black students, and indeed all students, have equal access to education. 70 years ago, the Supreme Court's unanimous decision in Brown versus Board of Education ended legal racial segregation in public schools. Writing for the majority, Chief Justice Warren said that equal public education is the very foundation of good citizenship. Public education is critical to the health of our economy, and it is essential to the viability of our multiracial democracy. Sadly, Brown's mandate to provide all students with quality learning experiences that respect their full humanity, intelligence, and dignity, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or gender identity or ability, is under fierce attack. Under the guise of promoting so-called school choice or parental rights, has emerged a reincarnated massive resistance to high-quality, equitable, and inclusive public education that performs for all. This massive resistance 2.0 seeks to achieve what George Wallace and his extremist acolytes could not: the hoarding of public resources to fund private education for a privileged few at the expense of the many. Our school system disproportionately fails low-income, Black, Brown, Indigenous, disabled, and new English learners in alarming ways. They faced vastly unequal educational resources, leading to significant disparities in academic outcomes. We can all agree that our K-12 system must do better. Yet, instead of working to fix these persistent actual threats to the future of our country, a well-funded cabal of activist organizations is lobbying for a separatist private school system funded by public tax dollars. As the organization that vanquished State-sponsored racial segregation in 1954, LDF stands firmly against a publicly financed, separatist, private school system in 2025. Over the past 30 years, racial segregation has steadily worsened in public schools. This shift correlates with two major changes: the decrease in court-mandated desegregation oversight and the proliferation of voucher programs that defund public schools. Privatizing public education and shirking federal responsibility would be disastrous for the 50 million students and their families who rely on public schools and the equal access that they are legally mandated to provide. President Trump's orders to restrict teaching and learning in inclusive and supportive environments and his threats to dismantle the Department of Education and upend critical enforcement of federal civil rights laws will demolish the very foundation of good citizenship. We must reject these proposals out of the Project 2025 playbook and approach public education with common sense and common purpose, not separatism and self-dealing. This Congress owes it to the millions of families who are scared of what these radical policies will mean for their children to choose a better path. Indeed, if we are being serious about educating all of America's children equally, we must implement a proactive vision that centers evidence-based interventions like universal pre-K, competitive teacher salaries, rigorous standards, whole child supports, as well as gun safety legislation to eliminate both barriers to equal education and to truly protect our children. Our country is at an inflection point, and so is American education. We can build a system in which all students can thrive, or allow our schools to remain spaces of division and inequality, with an escape route for some to line the pockets of private actors with public dollars. I hope this Congress will invest in the promise of every child in America by strengthening our public education system that serves us all. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Nelson. And now recognize you, Mr. Taylor.
Chairman Walberg, Ranking Member Scott, I do that every time. Chairman Walberg, Ranking Member Scott, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you. Thank you for giving us and me the opportunity today. At SHRM, we represent 340,000 HR professionals worldwide. We see firsthand the challenges of today's workforce. I just came back from Charlotte, North Carolina, where I presented to the management team the top 250 executives of Bank of America. And I can tell you they agree with everything that I'm about to say. The education to employment pipeline is leaky, it's broken, and it's busted. Now that said, our system is still the best in the world. We are proud Americans. But imagine what we could be if we unleashed the power of all of the talent. First, higher education is leaky. We've invested billions, yet degrees don't always align with market needs, as Dr. Cooper just mentioned. Employers are shifting their skills-based hiring, valuing experience and certifications over diplomas and degrees. Initiatives like Michigan State's Aligned Center, for example, and North Carolina's My Future NC initiatives prove that we can better connect education to employment. Secondly, K-12 education is really broken. We've undervalued vocational training, leaving students unprepared. Nearly 2/3 of our students lack reading proficiency. Programs like Aspire, which is the Aspire Trade High School in North Carolina, and John Bounds High School's agri-science program show hands-on learning works. I have a 14-year-old daughter right now in Virginia public schools. I know what's happening in our public schools. And I know that many of you have devoted your lives, including some becoming teachers of the year, because we are committed to making this work. Finally, our untapped talent pools remain overlooked. Millions of skilled veterans, older workers, those who are formerly incarcerated, individuals with disabilities, they have and are ready to contribute. We need them in the workforce. As the chairman mentioned, we have 7, almost 8 million open jobs in America. We don't have the luxury to exclude anyone from the workforce. If you're ready, willing, and able, we want you there. So we commend Chairman Walberg, Ranking Member Scott, Congresswoman Fox, and others for their leadership in updating the WIOA system. We believe that we need to get this done in Congress. We are heartened by the bipartisan interest in continuing the efforts of this Congress and encourage the following key provisions to be retained. Direct at least 50% of funds for training, leverage employer expertise, and create new staffing options. Members of the committee, the solution is clear. We need a national strategy that aligns education with workforce demands. And SHRM stands ready to partner with you. This just isn't about jobs. It's about people's lives and their livelihoods. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor, and thanks to each of the witnesses. Under Committee Rule 9, we'll now question the witnesses under the 5-minute rule. I ask members to keep our questions succinct so the witnesses have time to answer. Now I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Ms. Neely, in your testimony, you mentioned the problem of foreign influence in both higher education and K-12. Although the last administration failed to take this threat seriously, this committee introduced multiple pieces of legislation last Congress to help address this serious problem. Can you talk more about what steps Congress should take to protect our students and the national security?
Big picture, we have 3 things we need to do. We need transparency, we need notification, and we need consequences. Last session's TRACE Act and the Deterrent Act addressed these by providing access to curriculum so parents could know what their children were learning. Lowering the reporting threshold for the higher education foreign funding, creating K-12 reporting, and also looking into endowment funding, as well as disclosure to intelligence agencies about what money's coming in. Parents need to know so that they can make decisions whether they want their child in a classroom or not, and also whether school officials are receiving compensation or donations from foreign entities. And finally, there must be consequences. When these rules are broken, foreign actors as well as schools, be they universities or districts, must be held accountable for that.
Thank you. Dr. Cooper, colleges and universities often blame a lack of state funding for college costs, costs increasing, excuse me, twice as fast as inflation. Increased costs always get my throat. Over the last 2 decades. Yet those very same colleges have billions of dollars to spare when it comes to hiring administrators, funding DEI projects, or renovating their new football stadiums. In your view, is the lack of affordability at many institutions a funding issue or a spending problem?
I would say it's a spending problem. The United States colleges and universities spend more per student than any other colleges and universities in the developed world, more than twice as much as many European countries. What's more, state funding has actually been increasing on a per student basis over the last 10 years or so, yet we've still seen tuition go up. So I would argue that it's not state funding which is the issue, it's the underlying costs which are the issue.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Taylor, as you know, we almost got WIOA reform across the finish line last Congress.
Yes.
You talked in your testimony about provisions of that bill that would improve the nation's workforce system. But for members who are new to this committee in this Congress, could you talk at a high level about why it's important for Congress to finish our work on those reform efforts? And secondly, I would add to that, in other words, why is WIOA reform an important effort for us to take back up this Congress?
Mr. Chairman, with the reauthorization of WIOA, we have a generational opportunity to strengthen our nation's laws to ensure that American workers have the skills and the knowledge to succeed. You mentioned earlier, we have 8 million, almost 8 million jobs open in this country. We need to figure out how to solve for that gap. Employers are hurting, and it therefore affects American competitiveness. Many workers are seeking an alternative path to a job that doesn't involve a 4-year degree. WIOA and its programs are an opportunity for us to deliver that to workers. And key to delivering on this promise is to ensure that more, not less, WIOA dollars go to skilling and upskilling dollars that provide quality. That's what this is all about. What we know with everything that AI is about to do to us from a displacement standpoint, WIOA becomes more important, not less.
Yeah, thank you. And then briefly, Ms. Neely, give us your opinion why in recent years, as parents have re-engaged, especially after COVID, that they are seen regularly as a danger to our public education system especially, but to education in general.
Unfortunately, parents, when they started to get engaged in the system, asked questions and demanded accountability that the education industrial complex was not prepared to offer. They have been used to having our children behind closed doors for decades, spending money as they want, and programming them as they see fit. The Michigan Democratic Party, in the wake of the 2022 midterm elections, said that the purpose of a public education is to teach students what society needs them to know. They presuppose that they know what families need, what students need to know, not what families want them to learn. And so I think there's a big divide, and that's why I'm excited that we have an administration that now views families and students as stakeholders in this discussion, rather than just the activists and organizations that have been funding and demanding money for so long.
Thank you. I now recognize my friend from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Before I go into my questions, I have to at least put on the record that when WIOA was agreed to by both sides, it was actually included in the continuing resolution that was submitted by Speaker Mike Johnson, and then within the space of less than 6 hours, because of the intervention of the Trump transition team led by Elon Musk, that there were too many pages in the CR, that provision was stripped from the bill. We would today, if the Speaker had stuck to the agreement that he had agreed to and negotiated, we would have those WIOA reforms in place today. But unfortunately, again, the external pressure by the incoming administration tanked it, and that is just, again, a real step backwards for all of the issues that we agree on in terms of filling the job openings that are in the U.S. economy today. Mr. Scott began his remarks talking about the elephant in the room. There's, in my opinion, two elephants. One is to abolish the Department of Education. The second is the reconciliation bill, which, again, we are seeing, reporting that huge grant programs and tax assistance for higher education are on the chopping block, the human sacrifice to make sure that President Trump gets his tax cuts for the rich. That's what is being discussed right now in terms of paying for the reconciliation bill. Attorney Nelson, pop quiz for you. The Department of Education was created by statute in 1979. To abolish the Department of Education, Congress would actually have to vote on legislation to eliminate the agency. Isn't that correct? Right. And so since the enactment of the Department of Education, there have been consistent attempts by far right-wing Republicans in Congress. The last one as recently as March 24, 2023. Mr. Massey offered an amendment to H.R. 5 to abolish the Department of Education. That measure was defeated 265 to 161. 60 Republicans voted, in my opinion, sensibly to make sure that the Department of Education stayed in place. Again, the president's going to issue his executive orders pretending that he's actually doing achieving this goal. But as we've seen so far in the federal district courts, where his executive orders have actually been put to the test of Article 1, Section 9 in terms of Congress's authority for funding programs, he's batting 0 for 3. And again, I think it is important for us to remember a reality check that if the Department of Education's existence actually resides in this branch of government in terms of moving forward. Among the programs that the Department of Education funds, talking about workforce needs, is the Perkins Grant Program. And again, in my district, visiting career and technical trade schools, talking to comprehensive high schools that are now creating career pathway programs with money coming from the U.S. Department of Education to pay for welding booths, setups for nursing programs. The fact of the matter is that the Department of Education is a major partner and contributor to, again, achieving the goals, Mr. Taylor, that you mentioned. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Now, in terms of the reconciliation bill, which, again, we have seen that every committee, at Mar-a-Lago has been asked to, again, offer up offsets and pay-fors to pay for the tax cuts. one of the proposals that, again, was reported by Politico is a Republican proposal would make college scholarships taxable income. Again, Mr. Chairman, I would ask to enter into the record an article from Forbes magazine, hardly a far-left publication, that again describes what this proposal is that to make scholarships taxable.
Without objection,
Thank
so
you.
ordered.
Again, I think really it doesn't take a lot of imagination, and maybe, again, Attorney Nelson, you can help with this. It's just that taxing scholarships raises costs and shifts costs to students in terms of college affordability. Isn't that correct?
Yes, it would.
So, again, today's sort of discussion, which is sort of beginning on this premise that, we're going to have a normal discussion as far as, education policy. The fact of the matter is that the elephants in the room that Mr. Scott talked about in terms of basically blowing up the Department of Education and shifting costs to students is the real test, and that's what we're going to be confronted with, again, as the reconciliation bill comes forward and any package to abolish the Department of Education. And again, I look forward to joining those Republicans who voted no to abolish the Department of Education to make sure that that measure fails. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now I recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And we are very fortunate that we actually will be joined soon by the ambassador to the United Nations, Elise Stefanik. And so that will certainly enhance our hearing today. With that in mind, as we consider the state of education, I know firsthand of the positive parts of this, and that I am grateful my wife, Roxanne, taught at an alternative school, giving young students the opportunity of a second chance. My father served on the school board in Charleston, South Carolina, and my wife and I appreciate teachers where after the third grade, our four sons succeeded in math only because of educators, resulting in our oldest son, Alan, being the Attorney General of South Carolina. Our second son is an orthopedic surgeon. Our third son is commercial real estate, and our youngest is industrial engineering. And these successes are really due to educators making a difference. With that in mind, I believe it's because of the success of local elected school boards. And I very much support President Donald Trump for his courage to promote local elected school boards with the elimination of the duplicative, wasteful, interfering, and federal Department of Education. And the funding clearly should go to the students and not to bureaucrats. With that in mind, Dr. Cooper, the American Enterprise Institute is greatly appreciated for making a difference promoting limited government, expanded freedom. The AEI is crucial for addressing the challenges of American families, and we want to thank you for AEI. In your testimony, you note that the Grad Plus program provides effectively unlimited loans to students, allowing them to borrow institutionally determined attendance. In the other words, whether a school says it's 10,000 or 10 million, the federal government will provide a loan. The creation of this has coincided with doubling of the amount of graduate students borrowing. Given the structure of uncapped lending, is there evidence that colleges have used this to unduly increase tuition?
There is absolutely evidence to that effect. As you mentioned, the Grad Plus program is effectively unlimited. Students can borrow up to the cost of attendance as defined by the institution, which means if the institution says it costs $200,000 or $200 million, students are legally allowed to borrow up to that limit defined by the institution. And this has resulted in increases in tuition at the graduate level. A study published last year found that for every $1 of additional Grad Plus money that went out the door, colleges hiked grad school tuition by 64 cents. The Grad Plus program has grown enormously in scale and scope since it was created in 2006, and graduate student loans now account for half of new student loans issued every year by the federal government. So I would argue that the Grad Plus program has gotten relatively out of control, and some sensible caps on borrowing are needed.
Well, we look forward to AEI coming and producing alternatives. With that in mind, too, Mr. Taylor, you are right. That the workforce training has delivered tremendous success with partnerships between employers and educators. A stronger Workforce for America Act was authored by our former chair, Virginia Fox. Do you see what has been the success of that in my home state of South Carolina? We're so grateful. In the district I represent, Michelin Corporation, the largest manufacturing facility in the world. BMW, we want everybody to have an X5. Those are made in South Carolina. And then while you're at it, we can buy a Volvo, Mercedes van, Samsung products, Bridgestone, Japan, Lockheed Martin, Boeing 787-10. We'll be happy to sell everything because of workforce development. So how can this be achieved?
Well, you've taken my comments because that's it. It speaks for itself. Industry has benefited. The economy in South Carolina and ultimately in our country and globally has benefited from that very successful piece of legislation. I think we need more of it. We need to commit and double down on it. And so we violently agree that this has been net a significant win for employers and employees.
Well, hey, it's job creation, and
That's right.
we see it as South Carolina is now the leading exporter of cars and tires of any state in the union. I don't want people in Michigan to know that, but that's true. With that in mind, Ms. Neely, too, indeed, parents are under attack. But I'm really grateful that Representative Julia Letlow and the Republicans in the House passed the Parents' Bill of Rights. Is this legislation working?
It's a terrific first step. We look forward to continued engagement. We think there needs to be teeth. There needs to be actual, needs to be passed by the Senate. But I'm optimistic that going forward we'll be able to make sure that we deliver as a country for American parents and that we actually listen to them.
Well, thank you all for being here today. I yield back.
Thank you for most of your comments, Mr. Wilson. We're still the auto capital. I recognize my friend from California now, Mr. Tucano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Cooper, do you believe that the Department of Education should be abolished?
Well, I think that the Department of Education was
Just looking for a yes or no answer.
I think whether the programs that are currently operated by the Department of Education...
Do you think the Department of Education should be abolished?
I think it's immaterial whether the programs are operated out of education.
Do you think the Department of Education should be abolished, sir?
I really can't say because
I'll take that as a no. Ms. Neely, do you think that the Department of Education should be abolished?
We won 2 world wars without having a Department of Education.
So you don't believe it should exist?
I didn't
Mr.
say that.
Cooper,
I said
Mr.
we won 2
Cooper,
world
Mr.
wars
Cooper,
without
do you
a Department of
believe,
Education.
Madam, it's my time. Mr. Cooper, do you believe that the Department of Education should be abolished? Mr. Taylor.
I have to agree. I don't have a yes or no answer.
You don't have a yes or no answer. All right. So
The work of the Department of Education needs to continue. Whether or not the Department of Education as an institution. See, too often I think we
okay,
get
fine.
I want to be clear. The work needs to
I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying. So whether we abolish it or we reorganize it, do you believe that the president alone, Mr. Cooper, can eliminate the Department of Education or reorganize it, or does he need a vote of Congress to do so? Does he need to work with Congress to do that?
To eliminate it outright would require a vote of Congress, but there's probably some things he can do by executive order.
So he can just stop funding certain congressionally appropriated programs? He could just say, I'm not going to fund those? Tell Elon Musk just find that account and don't fund it?
It would depend on the program.
Okay. So you would agree that there are programs that are congressionally appropriated that he would need, he just doesn't have the power to impound.
I would argue that if Congress has specifically appropriated funding for a certain program, then the Education Department is obligated to fund that program, but there is some flexibility that the department has.
Oh, all right. So, but essentially, to eliminate the Department of Education, to abolish it, he would need the vote of Congress to do so.
I agree with that.
Ms. Neely?
I'm not a constitutional scholar, and this is outside of my area of expertise.
Oh, so you don't agree that that the Department of Education, which was established in law through a bill passed by Congress, signed into law by the President, that to abolish the Department of Education, that he would also need a vote of Congress to do that?
This is outside of my scope of area of
You don't know.
expertise.
You don't know.
But
you're an expert. You're an expert on.
I represent a parents' organization.
Okay, thank you.
My role in this hearing.
Mr. Taylor.
Yes, absolutely.
You would absolutely need a vote. Well, I'm glad that that we have at least 2 witnesses, from the majority who believe that a vote of Congress would be necessary, and I would hope that they would remind my colleagues on the other side of the aisle what happened at USAID over the weekend was illegal. that a president cannot unilaterally dismantle an agency or a department that was established in law, that what he did was outside the law and illegal. I mean, this hearing is called the State of American Education, but from what I'm seeing from the other side's behavior is that it really should be called the Republican surrender to a would-be king. I would love to discuss the state of education in America, and I would love to have any semblance of productive discussion in this committee. But the only solution that Republicans have offered us to the pile of problems that sit before us, whether it's the abysmal childhood literacy rates in this country, rampant gun violence in schools, the astronomical cost of higher education, and lifelong shackles of debt that we're signing up our college students for, is to abolish the Department of Education. Well, either way, let's imagine that legally or illegally the Department of Education has been dismantled. The department protects students and veterans who've been defrauded and are victims of predatory loan schemes for predatory for-profit colleges. This is critical for veterans who are disproportionately affected by the student debt crisis. Before COVID, student veterans had a 46% default rate on their loans. Mr. Cooper, if a veteran is defrauded out of their GI Bill benefits by one of the institutions known to prey on veterans, can they recoup that benefit?
For veterans, I'm not sure. For federal student loans, they can submit a claim through the borrower defense process to have their loans discharged.
Well, the answer is no. Once the GI Bill education benefits have been used by the students, they are gone forever. Yet my Republican colleagues continue to propose cutting regulations which protect these student veterans, including a loan relief after attending a failed school, rules that prevent colleges from preying on veteran GI benefits, and tools to discharge debt for students who have been defrauded by their institution. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize the gentleman from Florida, Georgia, excuse me. Georgia, Mr. Allen.
Yeah, we were in Florida last week. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this important hearing today. And before I ask questions, I'd like to briefly touch on school choice. Of course, we hear the same old talking points from the other side. We've got to turn education in this country around, and it's going to take some bold, strong efforts to do that. Innovation is where it's at. Somehow we've got to motivate students too. I mean, obviously, in this indoctrination of children is ridiculous. I mean, it's reading, writing, and arithmetic. It worked real well for a long time. A child's future success is often determined early in life, and in part of that quality is their K through 12 education. Parents and children should have the chance to choose an education path that is right for them. That's why I'm so excited to hear the current administration speaking so forcibly in favor of school choice. It's an 80% issue with parents in this country. With that being said, Mr. Taylor, with rising student loan debt and many young people reconsidering the value of a traditional college degree, there's a growing need for businesses to prioritize skills-based hiring over degree requirements. Last year, the CEOs of Walmart and the Home Depot co-authored an op-ed, "Not Everyone Needs a College Degree," highlighting the importance of this shift across industries. SHRM has been actively encouraging its members to adopt skills-based hiring practices. From your perspective, are more businesses embracing this approach, and what additional steps can be taken to accelerate this shift at the national level?
The answer is yes, and for the last 4 or 5 years, if you weren't following it, we have experienced a turnover to tsunami, as they call it, as well as the Great Resignation. We employers need talent. In a knowledge-based economy, you lose if you don't have the best talent. The best talent doesn't necessarily, and I want to be clear because we're not anti-college and university degree attainment, but the best talent shows up in different ways with skilled credentials. Ultimately, what we want is people who can do the work. Whether or not they have a degree and whether or not that degree is from a fancy school, employers are committed to allowing. Listen, we've got to fill these jobs, and we're filling the jobs because we have too many people who are underskilled. Our job is to eliminate, and I represent the world's largest association of HR professionals. We've got to get back to finding out, do you have the skills to do the job, not necessarily the paper that says you have the skills to do the job.
Yeah. Well, let it be said that Bill Gates dropped out of college because he happened to know more than the people that were teaching him. Mr. Taylor, while we all understand the value of a four-year degree, it's becoming clear that we need to shift the narrative around career pathways. Prior to my tenure in Congress, I owned a construction company in Georgia. So I understand firsthand the importance of having a trained workforce. Currently, there are over 400,000 open jobs in construction, and 40% of the construction workforce is set to retire in the next decade. Congress has taken an important step in supporting individuals pursuing skilled trade careers by championing the Bipartisan Workforce Pell Act, which would expand Pell Grant eligibility for short-term training programs. However, with critical labor shortages, additional action is needed. Mr. Taylor, beyond this legislation, what more can Congress do to expand access to skilled trades in education, both in high schools and through workforce training programs, to build a strong talent pipeline? In other words, there's some people that are motivated by other things,
right,
like skills. How do we tap into that?
Well, it starts in the K through 12 system. I remember going through school, and we recognized we'd have everyone stand up at the end of your 12th grade and say, who's going to college? And the people who weren't going to college weren't recognized. We've got to start with letting people know it is okay not to go pursue formal education in the way that we've historically thought about, and that it's okay to go get and acquire skills and they be credentialed, and then ultimately a credential that says to an employer you can do the work. So the narrative must change early that you have not failed because you did not pursue college. That's number one. Secondly, and you've rightly pointed out, after the passage of the legislation, we've got to now talk about it a lot and encourage employers. While people will say they will hire someone without a degree, what all of SHRM's research says is if you put someone in front of you and that person doesn't have a degree but the other person has experience, we still have a bias toward people who have degrees, even for jobs that very clearly don't require degrees. So this is going to require a collective commitment by industry, HR professionals, and thanks to you, we have government backing to make jobs available for people who can do the jobs irrespective of the skills, the degree that they may or may not have.
Mr. Taylor, I'm out of time. I have two more questions that I want to submit to you, and I'd like to provide, if you would provide answers to those questions for the record.
We'll do so immediately. Thank you.
And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Now I recognize the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Adams. Dr. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for hosting this hearing today. And to the witnesses, thank you for being here. Mr. Taylor, it's good to see you again. Let me just say this. I spent 40 years in the classroom, 40 years. So I didn't read about education in a report. I lived it. And I'll tell you right now that the way things are going, we're failing our children. And so that starts with teachers, because if we don't invest in the people standing at the front of the classroom, we can't expect students to succeed. So, Ms. Nelson, my first question is to you. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, according to the 2020-21 school year, only 6% of teachers identified as black. Why is federal investment in teacher diversity crucial to all student success?
Well, first, Representative Adams, thank you so much for your service as a teacher. It is critical that students in our multiracial democracy see themselves in the teachers that stand before them in their classrooms, in the school administrators, and in other leaders in this country. It is important that they see representation and diversity in every position of leadership, and it starts in the classroom. It starts with their teachers. We also know the Legal Defense Fund's Thurgood Marshall Institute has done research that proves that when black students are taught by black teachers and are taught by a more diverse faculty, their achievement soars. And if we want to invest in our students, we want to invest in a diverse faculty as well.
Thank you. You know, this isn't just about who's in the classroom. It's also about which institutions are being given the resources to uplift black students. HBCUs make up 3% of colleges in America, but we're producing 17% of all black bachelor's degree graduates, 24% of black STEM degree graduates, 40% of black engineers. So, Ms. Nelson, how are HBCUs uniquely positioned to support the growth and development of black students and their communities? If you can be brief, I want to get some more questions.
Sure. HBCUs have long punched above their weight, despite the fact that they've been deprived of adequate funding. We know that $13 billion of land grants have not been distributed to the institutions that deserve them by mandate of statute. So HBCUs deserve greater investment, and as you noted, they not only deliver the greatest number of graduates, they've delivered 40% of CBC members as well.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much for that, and thank you for the work that you're doing. I really appreciate that very much. Mr. Taylor, let me ask you a question. As chair of the White House Initiative on HBCUs during the first Trump administration, you saw firsthand how underfunding holds these institutions back. HBCUs contribute $16.5 billion to our economy every year, and that's the return on investment. Yet, our schools are still being shortchanged. So, do you believe that Congress should be investing more, and if so, what do you think is the holdup?
Well, and thank you for the opportunity. For those who don't know, I ran the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, the country's largest organization committed to advancing and protecting the policies for our country's publicly supported, so state HBCUs. I think I start with the fact that HBCUs are HBCUs. That is not a race-based designation. In fact, several HBCUs have more non-black students than black students. So that distinguishes them from them. It is not a race-based distinction. These are institutions that are open to all and historically have shown that to be the case. So it's really good that we have the numbers, but even still, these institutions are not that. What I did under the Trump administration, along with the support of Secretary Betsy DeVos at the time and President Trump, was to get the highest level of funding for HBCUs ever to that point. It still wasn't enough, to your point, and the Biden administration has continued that work. So this is not a political issue for us. These are incredibly important historic jewels that need to be funded. And it's not about the institutions, it's about the students who attend those institutions, who we in employment, in the employer side, need to fill those 7 or 8 million open jobs. So they are critical to our workforce diversity.
Thank you. Let me move on and ask about the Augustus Hawkins Center of Excellence, the grant. Program that's designed to support an array of teachers and address shortages, and that funded an HBCU in my state,
Yes.
North Carolina Central, NCCU, as we say. It was listed in the recent Office of Management and Budget memo freezing federal funding. Now, would you agree that this grant was on that list?
That concerns me. I have 2 NCCU graduates sitting behind me, one a 3-time North Carolina Central graduate and one who received his undergraduate degree, who happens, by the way, not to be black. And he attended a historically black college and university. Anything that takes away from not funding or defunding programs that work is net not good for our country.
Yeah, you mentioned that not all the students who attend are African American students. As a matter of fact, we have a former governor of North Carolina, Governor Easley, who received his degree from NCCU. So do you believe that the attempt to freeze those funds align with the commitment
The gentlelady's time has expired.
Expanding the educator pipeline? And you can send me that in writing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. I recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses that are here today on an incredibly important topic. I look forward to working with Mr. Chairman, your leadership of this committee throughout this Congress. Mrs. Neely, I'm a firm believer that a student's health and growth contribute to academic success. And as you've noted, we've had a troubling trend in recent years of academic declines across the country. To that end, I recently introduced H.R. 649, the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act, which allows school food service providers the flexibility to serve students all types of milk and school lunches, including whole milk. Can you describe as a parent yourself the benefit of providing students with a whole milk option in the school cafeteria?
Sure. Well, as a parent, my daughter's underweight, and whole milk actually is one of the few things that she drinks, and so I'm happy that I know she's at least getting some nutrients in addition to all the Doritos she has. But beyond that, certainly we want schools to have the flexibility to serve students both what they want as well as what they need. I think we have all seen the pictures of school lunches that have been thrown out, apples that are being wasted, both from a financial standpoint as well as just a nutritional standpoint. I think that's of concern. And so to have schools be flexible to choose what they want, I think is really important.
Oh, thank you for that. As the co-chair of the Bipartisan Career and Technical Education Caucus, once again, this Congress, I continue to see the rewards of high-quality, low-cost CT programs that provide learners of all ages with tools they need to succeed in the 21st century. Part of the recent surge in enrollment in career and technical education is thanks in large part to the substantial investments and reforms Congress has made to CTE over the years, much of that thanks to this committee. Including most recently the passage of my legislation strengthening career and technical education for the 21st Century Act. In 2018, it was subsequently signed into law by President Trump. Mr. Taylor, in your testimony, I noted two great examples of career and technical education in North Carolina and New York. Can you talk more about how these types of programs are equipping students with the skills and knowledge they need to fill the more than 8 million job openings in the United States today?
Yes, and thank you for this opportunity. Thank you also for your support of the legislation around cyber security and increasing the number of individuals who have the skills to help us from a national security standpoint. So thank you very much, Mr. Thompson and Congressman Thompson. Yes, I specifically mentioned in my comments and in our submitted proposal that there are two programs, one in North Carolina, one in New York, they're all over, but they specifically focus. One is on agri-science, and it starts in high school. So we don't wait until college to begin building this pipeline. And it's letting these students understand that there's a real career in agriculture and agribusiness, and there's significant investment. So it was a very wise investment on behalf of this Congress, and it's something that we think needs to continue to be reinforced. It helps employers in the back end. The one thing that I know, I've met with the presidents of John Deere, the presidents and CEOs of Cargill, and what they've all said to us is agribusiness is not sexy. People don't grow up and say, send my kid to go work for an agribusiness, although it is absolutely a part of America, our American economy, and our global dominance. And so we have said that sort of investment is critical, and starting in high school through those programs introduces students who would otherwise not know about it, or in the case of African American students who say historically we were pathed toward agribusiness jobs, and we don't want to go back there. So it's critical that we say there are huge opportunities there for all students, and so that's a great example of a program. We also have other programs that focus very early on cybersecurity training. Part of the problem when we look at the lack of diversity, for example, in employers who hire, is that the pipeline didn't provide us kids who were skilled, who were even aware of the opportunities in the cybersecurity world. Add to it what's going to happen with AI. If we don't get this early, we're in big trouble. And for all our efforts to want a diverse workforce, we're not going to be able to do it because we have not prepared and offered through the pipeline a group of students who are even aware of the possibilities.
Well, thank you very much. I do think that given the fact that career and technical education, including agriculture, is so much about innovation and technology today, it is getting sexier. I hadn't thought about it in that terms, but thank you for putting that in my head. Dr. Cooper, I'm out of time, but I have a question. I'll forward it to you. It basically is about accountability and national accountability in higher education and the role of states, which some states do better than others in investing in higher education. That makes a difference. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the sexy chairman of agriculture for your question.
I knew that was a mistake when I said it, actually.
That's a picture in my mind we won't forget. And now I go to the Harley rider from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for putting together this hearing on the state of American education, and congratulations on your first hearing as chairman. What a great topic, and because it impacts literally every one of our lives. So many of us talk about education as that pathway to a future that we all want. What many times we don't agree on is what education is and should be. And there are discussions say that it's absolutely this or absolutely is that. It's not. It's a little bit of each. It is as diverse as we are Americans. So the idea that one size fits all in education just is not the way to go. And quite frankly, we've heard time after time that in order to make it in America, you had to go to college. Well, you know what? That might be true for certain areas of careers. I want my medical doctor, certainly to go to college, and we might even need a couple lawyers. I'm not sure we need all of them, but I grew up I raised my son. I was a single father, and it was challenging, and that's 46 years ago. But I did something that was a little unique at the time that goes to part of the discussion here. I wanted to make sure that he and my daughter would see that you don't have to follow a certain road. I became a room mom for a bunch of fourth graders. I will tell you, 46 years ago, they weren't real interested in seeing a male walk through that door. But for the education of those children, I think it was incredibly important, and we've come so far since then. Mr. Thompson, hey, I think that work is sexy. I will tell you, career and technical education, our education system needs to be focused more on what the career, what the job is. I know it's great to have one of those pieces of paper up behind you, but that's not a job, that's not a career. So how we get there is really something that's critical. I focus a little bit on the earliest years and how do we get there. And we go through the schools in my district and quite frankly around the country. We see there are some real challenges. Schools are in dilapidated conditions. Cyber is just a thought if you don't bring it in. And that's why the ranking member, Scott, and I introduced a bill called Rebuilding America's Schools Act and invest $130 billion to go to those districts who need it most. Not everybody needs to have the shiny marble hall, but we need the basic educational ability to go into a school and do that. When we talk about creating opportunities for jobs, when we first started, vocational schools and inside regular high schools are happening everywhere. That fell off the edge, and now they're starting to come back because they're finding out that next generation to work with your hands is a value. So, Mr. Taylor, I just want to touch base on one thing. You mentioned that it starts with elementary education. I say it starts with parents.
Yes, fair.
to
say no matter what you do. I have a doctor, I have a lawyer, and I have an electrician. Right. I value each of them, and we as a nation have to value them. But Ms. Nelson, can you talk about infrastructure in school and why that is important? The basics have to be there.
Absolutely. Children should be in facilities that enable them to learn. We know that across the country there are fundamental inequities in school funding that leads to fundamental inequities in infrastructure. In the state of Maryland and Baltimore, for example, we have litigated cases that have shown that the school system there is suffering from buildings that have leaky ceilings, that have, bathrooms that don't function. And unfortunately, that's not limited to that state. There's the corridor of shame in the state of South Carolina, where there's students who receive minimally adequate education, if that. This is a chronic issue, and sadly, it cleaves along racial lines. It's something that we could certainly address with a better funding mechanism, and that is something that this Congress could take up.
Thank you. Mr. Taylor, what is your view on this and on infrastructure, particularly in the early years?
I think it's really important, obviously, for students to have great facilities, great teachers, et cetera, but I don't think the answer is solely throwing more money at it. We look at some school districts in this country who are in the state of Maryland, for example, who have no funding problem. Baltimore is one such example where more money has not solved the problem. So I think we have to be very careful about the idea that we can solve all of this by putting more money against it. Oftentimes there's money, but it's not applied in the ways that will most effectively benefit the children. And
so let's be clear, we're not talking about throwing money. We're talking about building infrastructure. That's very different than giving a check.
Often,
to a
though,
school
the
district.
question, the comment, the argument is we need more money to provide those foundational and infrastructure investments. So it ultimately comes back to, so people, yes, there's very few people I've seen disagree with the fact that children from every neighborhood, notwithstanding their zip code, should go into nice buildings and have air conditioning and heat like others, et cetera. That's not the debate. But then it becomes, but we need more money to do it. And the only point is we as employers who are paying into taxes want to make sure that the investment that we are making, that it actually yields a return on that investment in employers, in employment.
Thank you. As I'm looking, my seconds are going down. This is a great start to a conversations.
Your time has expired.
Sorry. Congratulations.
I know electricians can keep the juice going. So,
And I'm a single dad too, Mr. Norcross. I like that.
yeah. Now I have the opportunity to recognize the gentlelady from my birth state of Illinois, Mrs. Miller.
Thank you, Chairman Wahlberg, and thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. Mrs. Neely, you mentioned that Parents Defending Education has identified more than 12 million children in 1,100 school districts across our country impacted by parental exclusion policies. Our colleagues on the left sometimes argue that we are scaremongering to say that parents are being cut out of their children's education. Can you explain why this is a very real problem and how parents really do get cut out?
Representative Miller, as a parent and as a grandparent, you know that we have to sign permission slips to give our children aspirin or sunscreen in school. So the idea that our schools are now offering intrusive mental health counseling, telling children that they're born in the wrong body, that mommy and daddy might not love them because of their politics or their religion is something that is so abhorrent that this is happening with our tax dollars to our children behind closed doors. This is happening in 2025 in America. This is not a good use of taxpayer dollars. It is destroying the parent-child relationship, and it is not just LGBT students that are hearing this. Last year, or 2 years ago, Fox News discovered that 349 students or teachers were arrested for for child sex crimes, 75% of which were with teachers or with their students. These are horrifying statistics. We teach our children about stranger danger. And so to have our public officials turn around and say, you should keep secrets from mom and dad is something that is so devastating to a country, to a nation, that it is appalling that we are even having this discussion right now.
Mrs. Neely, you mentioned that China has waged an influence campaign to get themselves implanted in our K through 12 schools. What do we know about how many schools China has infiltrated, and what are they teaching in these schools?
We identified 143 districts around the country in 34 states, including 20 near military bases, where Chinese teachers, Chinese materials, curriculum had come directly from CCP-linked entities. The dollar amounts that were coming to these schools were very low. It's well below the Higher Education Act $250,000 threshold. But again, receiving curriculum, receiving books, we don't actually really know what's being taught. For all of our friends discussing teaching true history, are Tiananmen, Taiwan, Tibet, Uyghur genocide, are those covered in these classes? Almost certainly not. And so I think there's real concern as to who is coming in and what our children have access to behind our backs.
And I do want to challenge the parents in our country and taxpayers to get involved and find out what is in the curriculum in the school districts that they're supporting or their children are in. Books are silent teachers. To close, I would like to commend President Trump for his strong leadership to safeguard and strengthen our nation's education system. Last month, he issued an executive order to refocus schools on academic excellence and ensure education remains free from political indoctrination. On the same day, he signed another executive order promoting school choice and empowering parents to determine the best educational paths for their children. These decisive actions affirm the President's commitment to an educational system that prioritizes students and parents over government bureaucrats and teacher unions. Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and I recognize my faith-filled friend from Georgia, Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Chairman Wahlberg and Ranking Member Scott, and to our witnesses for being with us today. I have read your testimonies. Instead of addressing gun violence in our schools or taking real steps to get a handle on how expensive a year of child care or getting an education has become in this country, my Republican colleagues have been circulating a 50-page document going over ways that they can raise revenue at the expense of American families. Hidden deep in the leaked GOP memo is a proposal for a new tax on state and federal scholarships and fellowships, which I would like to submit digitally for the record. In my home state of Georgia, students and families have come to know and love the Hope and the Zellmiller scholarships, two programs that will pay for students' full yearly in-state tuition if they keep up their grades. I would like to make this very, very clear. National Republicans are proposing an increase on taxes for students and families in Georgia, an increase on taxes for families across this country. Students in Georgia know that if you work hard in school, the state will help you get through college and start a career. But this new tax threatens that promise and undercuts the financial security of Georgia's families, of this nation's families. Last year, more than 185,000 Georgians received almost $1 billion in scholarships and grants through the HOPE program alone. All of this award money, along with any other scholarship that a student earns, would now be considered taxable income if this proposal by House Republicans were to become a law. I'm a mother, and I know how important HOPE and other scholarships are to all the families across this country. I unfortunately never got to send my son Jordan off to college, but we certainly had been planning for it. And as a single mom working as a flight attendant before I came to Congress, figuring out how we were going to pay for it was something that I thought about often and every day. I thought about it until the day that he was murdered. The HOPE program was something I knew that Jordan and I could rely on, and it would be a gut punch for families who also rely on HOPE and other types of financial aid to no longer be able to count on these programs without receiving a new tax bill. I am horrified at this attempt. Families and students in our country deserve better. Ms. Nelson, my question is for you. In your testimony, you did talk about the importance of student aid. Can you briefly discuss the impact that taxing scholarships, grants, and fellowships would have on students and families at all income levels?
Absolutely, and thank you for also mentioning the issue of gun violence. I'd be remiss if I didn't say that there have been over 700 school shootings in the past fewer than 2 decades. But to your question about taxation of scholarships, not only is that concerning because it limits the opportunities to achieve higher education, what many who are advocating for so-called school choice will do with those tax dollars is siphon them out of the public education school system and use them to fund private education for just a few. So not only is it taking money out of the pockets of people who need that funding to pursue higher education, it is then funneling that money potentially into the pockets of private actors who are trying to usurp the public school education system.
Is that something that's becoming more of a problem throughout the nation? It seems increasingly that those dollars are going to that very end. And I just want to say thank you for that answer, and I know that I will do everything in my power that I can ensure that this proposal never makes it beyond this memo. And I encourage all of my colleagues to fight back against this tax increase that will make students and families' lives harder and more expensive back home. I'm talking to my constituents, and they are scared to death. How are they going to be able to afford to send their children to college? Most of the students across the nation, they need help. They need financial assistance. And why are we cutting them below the knees and preventing them from having what they deserve? It's a global and stellar academic education. They have to be able to globally compete. And this does not do that. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. Now I recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Rulli.
Thank you, Chairman Wahlberg. Mrs. Neely, we've seen Trump's work to combat DEI in schools. What else could be done to address the left-wing influence in our public school systems?
Oversight is a tremendously important thing. The executive orders are a great first step, but there's a lot of work to be done in Congress to put meat on the bones, to actually put the regulations in place. And so I think a lot of school board members are concerned about how this is going to affect them. They have seen that ed tech vendors have dropped down menus of pronouns, and so people are worried about exposure. And so I think that to the extent where we're able to offer some reassurance of how this process will unfold in a clear and orderly manner, I think that's important. But as we know, these activists are willing to die on this hill of dividing students along immutable characteristics, along race, along sex, along things like that. It is in the curriculum, it is in programming, it is in teacher training materials, and so there really needs to be a top-to-bottom examination, both at the local level, the state level, and the federal level. I know that the Department of Education has taken steps to put people on leave. I think that needs to extend beyond the federal government as well as going down to local activities, because there is so much money, as Mr. Taylor alluded to, in the system, but it is not making its way into classrooms. It is not making its way to students that need it. It's not making its way into teachers' pockets. The growth of the administrative state has been appalling over the past several years. And a lot of the ESSER money that we received or that we saw doled out under the Biden administration, again, was used for DEI programming in blue states like California and Illinois, and it didn't make it into addressing the tremendous learning loss that our children faced. And let's remember, even before the pandemic, American education was not in great shape. Our children deserve better. We have a lost generation of children right now that deserve an actual quality education.
I can't agree with you more. I was a school board member for 8 years, and the exciting thing I've seen in the last 2 years, Ohio is it's a home rule state, so we like to bring it back to the basics. But even when you look at Virginia, if you really want to take the school systems back throughout the country, you want to start at the school board meetings. Normally, we know at a school board meeting, it's very low attended. Normally, unless there's something really big and controversial going on, no one shows up there. But, the people have a very big voice within a school board, and school board members know we will be responsible for our constituents to be reelected. So your suggestions to parents that are concerned with things that their kids tell them that are taught in the school and how they approach that school board, do you have anything for that?
My organization has guides for parents, questions to ask, ways to speak, how to get involved. We're on the phone with parents 7 days a week, talking them through their 2-minute comments, making sure that they're hitting the high points. This is very much a case of the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. We cannot be everywhere. You can't be everywhere. The Department of Education can't be everywhere. And I think we have watched over the past 4 years Americans beginning to re-engage their civic engagement muscles that had frankly atrophied. So many people focus on the federal government, but where you live matters. Your backyard matters. Your local elected officials matter. And so for people to be able to get involved in that and not be shouted down by their school board members who frankly don't want the feedback that they're not doing a great job is a terrific first start.
I completely agree. And Mrs. Neely, you also mentioned that the schools are eliminating gifted and talented and even, I'm even hearing AP classes. Is this in the name of DEI? Why is this an awful decision in your opinion for the students?
Yes, unfortunately, we are watching what's called detracking. Multi-level classes are now considered a bad thing because some districts feel that the wrong races or the wrong kinds of students are in these classes. And so the solution then is frankly ripped out of Kurt Vonnegut's Harrison Bergeron. It's bring down the best performers so that everyone is frankly equally a low performer. My daughter is in a gifted program, and she gets bored when she's not challenged. I think we want as a country to encourage students to excel, to work hard. These are virtues that made America the envy of the world. And so why we would turn those aside and say, no, that's privilege, no, that's white supremacy, is something that is such a slap in the face. My grandparents met in an internment camp, and they were able to pull themselves up out of poverty after they got out of the camps. So to deny other people, or for teachers and administrators to tell people, because of your skin color, you can't achieve or you can't do better, the country is systemically racist, is a real insult. Students lack the basic skills to succeed in the global economy, and so we should try and bring up the low performers, but also celebrate the high performers.
I completely agree. Again, I think AP classes maybe could be what unites both sides of the aisle to get back to where we get our kids as the eye of the prize. So thank you so much, Mrs. Neely, and with that, I yield my time back to the chair. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize the educator for Connecticut, Ms. Hayes.
Thank you, and thank you to all our witnesses for testifying. I don't know who hurt you or what teachers your children have been exposed to, but that is none of this has ever been a part of my experience. This week, the Washington Post reported that the administration is preparing an executive order to abolish the Department of Education. President Trump has long promised to abolish the department, and Elon Musk has reiterated those goals on his social media platforms. Since its creation in 1979, the Department of Education has been committed to ensuring high-quality education for children across the country. As the chairman noted, there are about 1 million children who participate in private school choice programs, but 49.6 million children participate in public school education. What about them? Who is advocating for them? There are not enough slots in charter school programs for all 49 million of those children. The department protects the civil rights of students, supports students from low-income backgrounds, develops and prepares educators, provides resources for English learners, and is responsible for $1.6 trillion in federal loan programs. In addition, the department runs the National Assessment of Educational Progress and collects statistics on enrollment, staffing, and crime in school. The Individuals with Disabilities Act makes free and appropriate public education available to eligible children with disabilities. In the 2022 and 2023 school years, 7.5 million students received special education or related services through IDEA, or the equivalent of 15% of all public school students. Shutting down the Department of Education would profoundly impact Title I schools. It is telling that none of the witnesses on this panel could say affirmatively yes, that the department should be shut down, because you know that the answer is no. The department administers $18.4 billion in Title I program funding to low-income K-12 schools. Also, as I mentioned, the department runs $1.6 trillion in student loan programs, one of its largest missions. Mr. Cooper, in your opening, you talked a lot about the cost of college. And I think that the conversation we should be having is how do we lower the cost of education, not discourage it. Because while many of you have a very short memory, I chose to go to college because my grandmother could not. There were laws prohibiting it. So while you throw around and weaponize words like diversity, equity, and inclusion, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund did not come into play in these conversations as a nice gesture. It was to push back on laws that prohibited people like my grandmother from pursuing higher education. And while you are correct, Mr. Taylor, we need to prepare the next generation workforce. As we know, in an industrialized nation, that is not just going to be people who work in factories. That is going to be the doctors and the lawyers and the teachers and the social workers and the community leaders, the engineers, which all require college degrees. What we should be doing is trying to make every opportunity available to every student that wants it, no matter what that opportunity is. Ms. Nelson, can you talk a little bit about what would happen to the 7.5 million children who receive services related to IDEA from the Department of Education and need for us to be advocating for them? What would happen to them if the department is dismantled?
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned the number of federal statutes that the Department of Education is responsible for enforcing, along with the Department of Justice. Children who need IEPs, individual education plans, because they learn differently, because they have challenges in different ways, would be bereft of any federal support without the Department of Education. They would have to rely on state and local governments that are often underfunded and often don't have the expertise to enforce federal law. The Department of Education is an absolute necessity to the survival and thriving of this nation's students, and especially those who are more challenged.
Have you seen a push for all of these voucher programs and private charter school programs, a push to attract those students?
No, and that's the
I haven't
problem.
either.
That's the problem with these private schools being funded with public tax dollars. Private schools are not required to accept all students. They often reject students who have learning disabilities or who somehow don't fit the mold of a private school child.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady, and I recognize the gentleman from Missouri, new member of the committee. Glad to have you on it, Mr. Under.
Thank you, Chairman Wahlberg, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing here today. In the United States today, we are faced with a cruel irony that regarding K-12 education over the last decade, and this trend does go back much further, we have spent more and more on education, public education, and gotten worse and worse outcomes. I spent a decade in the Missouri General Assembly, 8 years of that on the Senate Education Committee. And over again, lobbyists for the school administrators, the School Board Association, the teachers' unions came to our committee and they had one message: give us more money. Give us more money. And in Missouri, and these are national statistics, indeed we have been giving public education more money. We're up to now about almost $16,000 per student K-12. And at the same time, here are our NAEP scores, of which the most recent data came last week. These are plummeting. They plummeted worse after COVID. I would say not after COVID, after the government response to COVID, which was very dysfunctional and very harmful. But we have this irony that we're spending more and we're getting less in the way of favorable outcomes. At the same time, we have what are we spending the money on? Well, here's a graph of the growth in the blue and the green are the growth of students and teachers, about 8%, both almost identical. 37% growth in principals and assistant principals, and 88% growth in other administrators. And by the way, the teachers make on average $70,000 a year, actually a little less in Missouri, unfortunately. The administrators on average make $103,000 a year. So this is where our money's going. This is where our money's going. We're taking our eye off the ball and not focusing on what really matters, which is these teachers teaching these students how to read and write and do math. And what's worse is we're getting our eye off the ball in other ways. Instead of teaching reading and writing and math, not what to think, but how to think, instead, Mrs. Neely, we're spending time doing things like, running urgent care centers in schools, all the wraparound services, whatever. If we can't teach kids how to read, what are we doing running pediatrics offices and urgent care clinics? And even worse yet, we're indoctrinating these kids with pernicious ideologies. Kids are learning about the 15 latest genders, but not how to do multiplication, division, and all. So, Mrs. Neely, I believe, by the way, that the federal government is playing a very negative role in all this. The federal government is only providing 11% of the funding, but driving this administrative bloat. But what can we, and I believe abolishing the Department of Education is definitely a big part of the solution. There are some good functions in the Department of Education, IEPs and so on, but they could be spun off. But Mrs. Neely, how can we get back on the focus of of educating kids rather than indoctrination and bloating our school bureaucracies?
Unfortunately, I think a fish rots from the head. President Biden had a day one executive order injecting equity into everything. And we saw that play out in the form of grants, in the form of other things. As you know, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And every federal dollar that goes out the door has strings attached to it, where they know that they have to prioritize equity over student excellence. Let's think back to the NEA's annual meeting several years ago, where the General Assembly vote did not vote through to focus on student excellence, but they do vote on things like abortion, on foreign policy, on things like that. And so we have teachers union leaders that have sold out their members, prioritizing things like restorative justice over actually educating children, keeping teachers safe. And teachers right now have taken on such a large load. They are an emotional support animal. They're a gender support transition counselor. That's like a $250,000 a year job. That's not a $50,000 a year job. Our teachers deserve better, and I think they want to get back to the basics because that's what they were hired for.
And when I talk to teachers in my district, and I'm a physician, when I've talked to my patients who are teachers, they don't want to do any of that. The great majority of them don't. Some are ideologues, but the great majority don't. They're doing it because, as you say, the federal government is driving this train. They're paying the piper. They're calling the tune. So thank you for your testimony. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and now I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Mannion. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Scott, and thank you to the witnesses that are joining us here today. I was a former teacher of almost 30 years. I taught science, physics, astronomy, geology, chemistry, AP biology, 15-to-1 living environment. I worked directly with students, families, and other teachers. Education is the great equalizer. It's also the great stabilizer. And our public schools are the cores of our community. I was also the founding chairman of the New York State Senate Committee on Disabilities. I'm also a parent. I understand how critical it is to make sure that our schools are well funded, that our students have all the resources they need to be successful, and that our teachers are supported and have that as well. In the New York 22nd Congressional District, it's the home to great public schools that are supported by our communities. Families choose to move to my district because of our fantastic schools. Between my wife and I, we spent nearly 60 years in a classroom, and we spent those years in both private, public, urban, suburban, and other settings. I've seen the disparities that exist between our own public schools and the inequities that impact the chances of students meeting the great American dream and having that great equalizer of public education. I'm glad that we're having this conversation today because there are areas of education that do need improvement. But some of the things that I've heard today have nothing to do with what's happening in the classrooms. And I encourage, as the previous congressman mentioned, that you have conversations with your teachers, with your friends that are teachers, with your family members that are teachers, that you trust. Also, as a New York State legislator, I was proud to support record funding for our schools as they are performing more necessary functions for our communities. And we're asking teachers, social workers, and school psychologists to do more than they ever had before. And as the cores of our community, they have the ability to do so and have. I've also increased expansion of universal pre-K into various areas of the state. I more than doubled apprenticeship funding so that people can change careers at whatever point in their lifetimes, including in their secondary education setting, and that has transformed lives. My question is for Ms. Neely. I started teaching in 1993. Since that time, we have increased the number of parent-teacher organizations specializing in things like special education PTOs. We also have an increased number of Meet the Teacher nights. We live stream school board meetings. We have websites that have access to syllabi, curriculum. We have easy access to teachers with emails and phone calls. And beyond all that, we also have students in classrooms with cell phones that are audio taping, videotaping, or live streaming instruction in those classes. My question is a yes or no question. Do you believe over the course of the last generation that parents have less access and input into education?
Yes, I do.
I would argue that my experience and my wife's experience in a classroom and my experience as a parent, your comment is highly subjective and inaccurate.
Thousands of parents around this country would love to have access that your district does. I have talked to hundreds of parents around the country who have to file public records requests on a regular basis to have access to those curriculum, to have access to lesson plans. I myself, through my organization, have paid approximately $100,000 over the past 4 years to gain access to emails, lesson plans, and things like that. I know how to fight, but most average parents don't know how to. And when they do ask questions, when they show up at a school board, they are shouted down, they are called names, they are doxxed by their colleagues and by members of the school board.
Thank you, Ms. Neely. I believe what you're referring to are very outlying instances.
I believe you're
in New York, we have over 500,000 students that are identified as students with disabilities. I participated in CSE meetings and both sides of that table. Parents understand that it's necessary to continue the Department of Education and that these students receive a fair and appropriate public education. Do you believe that fulfilling our federal requirements for our students with disabilities is a distraction, as you've stated in the past? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like to now, Mr. Harris, North Carolina.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to all of our witnesses. Thank you all for your participation today in this hearing, and I have had the opportunity to review your testimonies. And Ms. Neely, I was taken in your testimony that you mentioned a threat of foreign adversaries posed to our students. We know from reports from watchdog organizations like yours that foreign funding is an issue at the K-12 through 12 level and in higher education. Because of the lack of accountability and transparency, this is likely just the tip of the iceberg of what we know. For example, this committee worked with a select committee on the CCP and found that nearly 24 universities across the country had specialized joint research partnerships with China involving sensitive military technology. I'm particularly shocked by the lack of caution our schools have when partnering with our greatest foreign adversaries, such as the Chinese Communist Party. In fact, all of this led me to introduce the No Contracts with Foreign Adversaries Act, which would begin to tackle this problem at the collegiate level by requiring institutions to disclose contracts with China, North Korea, Russia, and Iran. But my question to you, Mrs. Neely, is can you just elaborate what harm does the take money first and ask questions later approach have for our students as well as for our national security?
Unfortunately, I think most school districts are not aware of the threat that is posed. In Fairfax, the Thomas Jefferson School for Science and Technology, formerly America's #1 magnet school, partnered with Tsinghua University High School, which is that partners with Tsinghua University, a Chinese military school that is supervised by the Chinese defense industry, according to the Australian Security Policy Studies. The Simpson County Board of Education in Kentucky entered into an agreement with the North China Electric Power University, which works directly with the Chinese government's energy sector to push China's global energy initiatives as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. These are things that local school boards and school districts are not aware of whatsoever. Oftentimes, this is secure or classified information that these kinds of things are taking place. And so for us to open our doors and open our databases to these foreign adversaries is something that I think is appalling and that really needs federal intervention. So thank you for your work.
Well, and thank you for your work and for, again, bringing this information forward, because I think it's going to be absolutely critical in protecting our national security as well as our students going forward. Switching gears just a little bit, in the public school system, Ms. Neely, this again is to you, who currently has more influence over a child's intellectual development, parents or bureaucrats?
Unfortunately, it seems to be bureaucrats at this moment in time. When you have school officials that are telling children that their parents' love is conditional, that their parents might not love them because of their religion or their politics, that really throws up a wall that, unfortunately, is going to create lasting damage much beyond a child's graduation from high school. And so, while parents often, I talk to them and they say they have to deprogram their kids from what happens in school, there is both the pressure of trying to conform to and please an authority figure like a teacher or a principal, as well as the peer pressure because everyone else around them is also getting inculcated with the same materials.
Well, and I think and as a follow-up to that, I think your point is well taken. Is a federal system of supporting education really structured to empower parents, or is it set up more to empower school systems themselves?
Right. I mean, I think, looking at the influence that the teachers union leadership has had over the federal government over the past several years is something that I know is likely to taper off over the next coming years, and I think American families are excited about that.
Well, and I'd like to give you a moment just to discuss any examples you've seen of parental rights being trampled on at the expense of the woke gender movement that I think all of us in the country have been aware of.
I think in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, they had a sign up, and they also had teacher training materials that said, the right to know a child's gender identity is something that must be earned. I mean, the idea that I have to earn information about my child is something that's appalling. We've watched districts weaponize FERPA, the Federal Education Rights and Privacy Act, saying that children have a right to privacy from their parents. That was not the original intent of the law, and to watch local officials take and bastardize something that was intended to be both a sword and a shield for families is something, again, that is a deep slap in the face. There are federal statutes in place, be it the PPRA, where that governs the amount of information and what questions districts can collect from students. Oftentimes, school officials don't even know that there are things where if they're asking students about sexuality, about drug use, about politics, that they have to notify parents and give families an opportunity to opt out. That's because school officials are not learning what their obligations are under the law. When they learn from their school associations, when they learn from the superintendent association, the principals association, they're learning about woke topics instead of learning about their actual responsibilities.
Well, thank you so much. And I would say, I mean, you've been a wealth of information this morning, and to all of you on the panel, we appreciate, again, your service and the information that you've made us aware of today. And, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back my time.
Thank you. And I would like to recognize member from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. I'm not going to sit in this hearing today and pretend that everything is normal, because it's not. We're barely 2 weeks into the new administration. We've already seen extreme attacks on public education straight out of the Project 2025 playbook. And here's a reminder. Members of Congress swear to support and defend the United States Constitution. And no member of either party should stay silent as the Trump administration and Elon Musk take unconstitutional and illegal actions to withhold appropriated funding or to violate our constitutional separation of powers. I know that Democrats and hopefully some Republicans, because we've seen that over the years, will stand against attempts to weaken or dismantle our system of public education or divert federal dollars from public schools to private educational institutions that are only available to a few and generally not accountable for their student safety and success. Yesterday, I was proud to introduce House Resolution 94 with more than 60 of my colleagues in defense of public education and in defense of the civil rights protections provided to students under the authority of the U.S. Department of Education, an authority that is granted by Congress. And I have to say, I'm pretty disappointed that the chair of this committee said yesterday that he would support efforts to depower the Department of Education. We are all here to, I would hope, do what's best for the students in this country. Ms. Nelson, you testified that voucher programs and the lack of the kind of public school accountability and transparency that's required of public schools, do they obscure whether taxpayer dollars are effectively spent and whether students receive the support they need? That was in your testimony. You also testified that divestment from public education in favor of privatized education will exacerbate the kind of transparency and accountability that's in the public system. And I also want to note that I represent a lot of rural communities. I represent urban communities as well. And in rural communities, they don't want their public education dollars taken away and say, here, we're taking away your public education dollars. Here's a voucher. There's no place to use it because there's no place even close by to use a voucher. So what are the challenges with holding private schools accountable? Do we know how students are doing in these schools?
Yes, and thank you for naming the elephant in the room, the elephant in this country, and that is what is basically a grand larceny of our entire federal government while we stand by and watch folks in this room attempt to pickpocket public education. You talk about transparency and accountability, and I've heard that mentioned by some of the witnesses on this panel. If we're serious about those two concepts, we know that private education does not have the same oversight that public education does. It certainly would not have sufficient oversight if we were to dismantle the Department of Education. Private schools operate under the radar. We don't get to collect the same data and information that we do in public schools. So the idea that we're necessarily giving children a better education in private school is anecdote. It is not clear.
Don't mean to interrupt, but I want to get some more questions in. What happens if parents take one of these vouchers and then go to a private school and they discover that, gosh, this isn't what everything they promised? Is there any recourse for them?
Well, they can try to return to a public school, but if we were to take this to its full logical conclusion and parents are shopping children around to different private schools, we know that the infrastructure of public schools and the public school system will significantly deteriorate.
And I appreciate that, and I wish I had 5 hours to dispel some of the myths that I've heard here today, but I want to ask you about this so-called parents' rights campaign that calls for narrow-minded book bans and revision of curricula. Now, everybody in this committee knows, because it's the law, that the federal government does not dictate curriculum. And a lot of the issues I've heard discussed here today are local issues. So recent efforts, including the so-called Parents' Bill of Rights that actually moved through the House last Congress, have been written in ways that could really harm vital mental health support for students. And behavioral health care, the need for behavioral health care, is something I hear about constantly. In fact, the National Association of School Psychologists indicated that the bill would, quote, undoubtedly exacerbate the youth mental health crisis and undermine efforts to improve school safety. I hope we all care about school safety, and if we really cared about school safety, we'd do something about gun violence. But how would this Republican Parents' Bill of Rights and the dismantling of the Department of Education affect resources and policies that foster a safe and healthy school climate? And how would students, schools, and communities be harmed?
Well, children need additional supports. Of course, we all agree that children should receive basic education. They should leave school with skills. They should learn reading, math, and everything else. But they also require additional supports. As any parent knows, as I know as a parent, students are not just what they learn in a textbook. They are nurtured by their teachers, they are nurtured by their environments, and they deserve the types of investments that will enable them to succeed. What we've heard a lot today is a lot of anecdotal conspiracy rhetoric about what is happening in schools. As a proud product of the public school system and a proud parent of children who have attended public schools, I've seen nothing of the sort of what's been alleged today.
Same. I spent years as a very involved public school parent, and I have to say that children don't learn when they're hungry or when they're sick. So the thought of withdrawing support or that support for students is not appropriate is baffling. I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize my friend from Indiana, Ms. Mesmer. Mr. Mesmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Taylor, apprenticeships are a proven model of pairing paid on-the-job training with related technical instruction to educate workers for career success. Despite the growth over the past decade, registered apprentices only make up about 0.3% of the workforce. What are the greatest barriers to broader adoption of apprenticeships from an employer standpoint? And what are some of the challenges in engaging students to pursue those apprenticeships?
Thank you, Ms. Messer. We're huge supporters of apprenticeships. From SHRM's standpoint, we need them, again, to address the worker shortage and, more importantly, the skilled worker shortage. The earlier that we can allow people, for example, who do have college degrees to gain experience while in college, often through registered apprenticeships, we're increasing that pipeline of highly qualified workers. The barriers are, one, the word apprenticeship suggests, especially when you speak to people coming out of higher ed, that it's not quite, you don't need an apprenticeship. I'm a lawyer for training, for example, and my apprenticeship was considered a summer associateship. So it's the way we talk about it that has made it less attractive to students. And so they don't rush to that because they assume that apprenticeship is tied to me becoming a welder, which is a very good job and may pay more than that lawyer who graduated from law school. But at the end of the day, we have to work on what has been the stigmatization of that word apprentice. That's a barrier. And then secondly, and significantly for historically underrepresented communities, oftentimes these apprenticeships are unpaid. And I got to tell you, as much as one wants to get experiential treatment, if you have to choose between, and oftentimes children, I was one of those children who had to spend the summer making money to pay for school for the next year. And so if I had the choice, had to make the tough choice between an unpaid apprenticeship and working a job that didn't necessarily give me skills that would prepare me to be a better lawyer, but one was unpaid, that's a problem. So to the extent this Congress can help us fund those apprenticeships, those are the two significant barriers that we see. And by the way, it's not limited to historically underrepresented groups. There are a number of majority members who come from places like West Virginia where they may be financially challenged and they can't participate in apprenticeship programs because of funding.
Thank you. Mrs. Neely, tomorrow I will introduce the Instruct Act, which will require intelligence agencies to boost their interagency coordination on foreign harmful influence in our schools, along with retroactively share all past reports on the topic across departments. In your opinion, do you view this legislation as a step in the right direction?
I think absolutely it's a step in the right direction. Schools collect such a vast amount of data about children on a regular basis, and frankly, it's not secured very well. We all hear on a regular basis about schools being hacked, data being held by ransomware. What is going to happen when the information about either military families or just average families is held by a hostile foreign power that seeks to exploit us? I think it's terrifying, and I think your bill is a step in the right direction.
Thank you. Does accepting money from foreign sources lead to an education system being beholden to the values, influences that don't share American values?
Absolutely. We don't know who is writing the books. I think for parents to actually know that information means that they can make an informed decision whether they want their child to enroll in a Mandarin course taught by a Communist Party official or if maybe they want to take a Spanish course instead. Parents deserve the right to make that decision with complete information, which as of this moment in time, they currently do not have.
Thank you. In my home state, school choice programs have shown to statistically benefit minority populations at a much higher ratio than the rest of the population. Mrs. Nelson, can you validate with statistical data rather than anecdotal claims that school choice programs penalize minority students?
Certainly, and I'm so glad that you raised your state of Indiana, where more than a quarter of the students who are required to repeat grades in your state are Black, and nearly a tenth are Latino. I will tell you that school vouchers in many of the programs that we are aware of have actually decreased the learning of the students who have those vouchers. It has not improved their educational outcomes. It has left them...
You can provide statistical data to show that?
I can provide statistical data.
It's contrary to what we've seen in our state. So.
Well, I'm happy to share what our studies have shown. And in fact, if we look at the state of South Carolina, I'll give you that example, where the Supreme Court of the state of South Carolina just last November in a court case held that their voucher program contradicted the state constitution and was unconstitutional because it drained resources from the public school system. So there are significant concerns not only about the educational value when you use school vouchers, but also what it does to destroy the public school system for the rest of the children, the vast majority of children who are left without vouchers and are in the public school system. We don't just want to focus on those who have vouchers. We want to focus on the majority of students in this country, the nearly 50 million who don't have vouchers to shop around and try to find a better education.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to now recognize from Pennsylvania, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am glad that we're having this hearing today because I do strongly agree that the state in America, the state of education in America should be a concern for all of us. I think that perhaps I disagree on what are the most serious threats. I disagree on the seriousness of the assertion that those most serious threats are things such as woke ideology or radical indoctrination, or the fact that LGBTQ plus people exist. I, however, do believe that among the most serious threats are the active and deliberate dismantling of public education. Republicans focus on demonizing our most marginalized students to distract from the fact that they have no intention, or we have simply not heard of any intention to actually improve the state of education. Throughout not just this hearing, but in general around this topic, we hear a lot of buzzwords, such as school choice, our parents' rights, our education freedom, our indoctrination, our federal overreach. And that is by no coincidence. These are talking points that we saw were core tenets of Project 2025. In this plan, conservatives outlined how they would dismantle the Department of Education, gut public education, strip away civil rights protections, and impose an extreme ideological agenda on our schools. Right now, the president is reportedly preparing an executive order to bypass Congress and illegally impound funds within the Department of Education, a first step toward dismantling the agency altogether. The president has promised to attack these institutions, and he's doing that. Let's be clear about what these policies really mean, because we've seen them before. These are the same arguments that were used to resist desegregation, to justify pulling public dollars out of integrated schools and pouring them into segregated academies, and to privatize or prioritize incarceration over the education of black and brown students. The language has changed, but the goals seem to remain the same. Attorney Nelson, when we hear conservatives pushing for parents' rights and claim to be fighting against indoctrination, what do you see are the natural consequences of these efforts? And what influence do you think it has on our students' curricula or the learning environment for the students or the teachers?
Yeah, we absolutely believe that parents should be involved in children's education. This is not a new concept. If you talk to any teacher would welcome parents to engage. What we don't want is parents to try to override the expertise of teachers who we have hired because they are specialized in teaching and training students about what should be in the curricula, about what should be in terms of our national standards, right? Federal laws that have been passed, that have been informed by experts, research, and other data, not the anecdotes that people want to bring to advance their own political ideology. So inviting extremist groups like Moms for Liberty to determine what the curricula of this country would be absolutely disastrous. They would be peddling a indoctrination by ignorance, indoctrination by deprivation of knowledge. And that certainly does not allow us to be a competitive country and does not serve all of our children to succeed.
Yeah, very quickly, do you believe that dismantling the Department of Education would help us fulfill the promises of Brown?
Absolutely not. It would be counter to the very premise of Brown. The Department of Education began because we recognized the need for there to be national standards and national oversight of our public education system, and for there to be a federal apparatus to enforce our federal civil rights laws as they pertain to education and other laws.
Thank you. How do you think, if at all, do these conservative policies or proposals make our students more competitive, improve the global standing of the United States, or prepare our students to enter emerging careers, or ensure that our students will be prepared to address the significant challenges on the horizons?
No, to the extent that these conservative policies attack diversity, equity, and inclusion, basic principles of fairness, those are America Last policies. Those are not policies that will advance our students to become competitive in an increasingly global marketplace, in an increasingly global economy. We should be leveraging our diversity. It is our greatest strength. We should be leveraging multilingualism. Instead, we are trying to find ways to really narrow the focus of our education and to replace it with conservative extremist ideology.
Thank you. And while the most harm, per usual, will be black and brown students, students with disabilities, and other marginalized students, we will all pay the price, as Attorney Nelson just said. While our commitment to racism may be lucrative for the billionaires running the administration right now, the rest of this nation will learn that we will all sink or swim together. The outcomes and disinvestment reserved or accepted for the black students will be reflected in our global standing in tech and innovation. While other nations invest in all of their students to increase their global competitiveness, racism in our public schools will serve as an anchor for ours. I thank you, the panel, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady, and I recognize the vice chairman of our committee, Mr. Owens from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, this is such an important hearing, state of our education, one of the most important conversations we're going to have about our most important national resource, our children. It's been interesting. First of all, we can all agree, based on recent results, that our present educational system is failing our children miserably. We pay more per child than any other industrialized country except Luxembourg, and yet 60%, this is not anecdotal, 60% of our fourth graders, 70%, this is not anecdotal, of our eighth graders are failing based on the NAEP reading and math proficiency scores. We are paying more per student with a lower return on investment, 70% failure rate, and we can no longer do this. And I'll be honest with you, I would be a little bit more accepting as a stakeholder of the NAACP if they were not silent when 75% of our black boys were found in 2017 not to be able to read and write in the state of California. We have here in Baltimore zero proficiency in math for many of our students. We have black mothers and fathers lining up to get into a choice, a voucher program, because they're living in a zip code, the kids cannot get educated. And we have the audacity to say we're experts at education. The parents are ignorant. And yet we have this remarkably failing system. The answer has been so far, let's put more money into it. You know, I've been hearing this for 40 years. We cannot disturb, we cannot mess up this system because our kids, we can't take our kids out because our institution will fail. Well, when we have this kind of failure, we need to make sure our kids are focused on in that direction. We need correction through innovation, merit through every piece of the pipeline, and the only way to do that is having these conversations and giving our parents a choice. Ms. Neely, I want to say thank you. It's good to see you again. And I thank you for the support you have for thousands upon thousands of parents across this country that are not really respected in this body here. You other stakeholders, as a parent, I know what's best for my kid, and I would think everybody in this room would feel the same way. You would do everything you could to get your child out of a failing school system. Well, we need to start looking at other people's children the way we look at ours. Ms. Neely, your testimony, you mentioned the school districts paid DEI consultants millions of dollars. Can you explain to us exactly how those DEI consultants have been, what they were paid for?
Sure. In 2021, we released what we called our consultant report card. We identified over 100 consultants with hundreds of contracts in dozens of districts across the country, making money hand over fist, encouraging districts to do things like privilege walks, privilege bingo, things that are not helping children but are actively hurting them. A study by the Network Contagion Research Institute showed that DEI programming, surprise, surprise, leads to more divisions in interpersonal relationships. And so when we see districts spend money on this, it actually might have been better use literally lighting on a fire, because at least then children would be warm instead of hating each other.
Dr. Cooper, critics of the market-based and accountability mechanisms such as risk sharing and performance funding often argue that they would punish the open access institutions or deter colleges from enrolling low-income students who have a lower likelihood of success. However, these critics don't seem to fit your testimony as it relates to accountability system proposed under the College Cost Reduction Act. What did you find in your analysis of the bill's accountability system? And do you believe the schools would ultimately reduce the share of low-income and disadvantaged students they enrolled as a result?
My analysis of the College Cost Reduction Act found the exact opposite of what the critics allege. We find that open access institutions, community colleges, regional public four-years would actually benefit from the College Cost Reduction Act because the CCRA rewards schools for enrolling low-income students and also serving them well, getting them through, making sure they graduate, making sure that they have good earnings after graduation and that they're keeping their prices to a reasonable level.
Okay, thank you. I have a question, Ms. Till, I'm going to have done in writing and sent to you. I'll just say this. I grew up at a time where education was our gateway, segregated community. We led our country because parents and teachers understood their responsibility to their kids. Led our country to growth middle class, men matriculating from college, men committed to marriage, percentage of entrepreneurs in a segregated black community because education was put in place to help our kids, not this institution. We're going to change that. And for those who don't get it yet, let me suggest you go out and talk to some parents who really are stuck in these areas that they can't get out of. Matter of fact, I'll take it further. How about taking your kids and letting them go into these failing schools and just see how cool it is to have all this other stuff going on, and reading, writing, and understanding math is not a priority. So we're going to make this change. I'm excited about the process. I look forward to working with my colleagues across the aisle. Kids should come first. That's our top priorities. Thank you, and I'll yield back to Chair.
I thank the gentleman and recognize the passion that allows you to wear a Super Bowl ring. And who should I bet on? No, we won't. Now I recognize the gentleman from Texas, a new member of our committee. Glad to have you on it. Welcome, Mr. Kassar.
Thank you, Chairman. Today, we've heard from House Republicans on this committee support for Trump and Musk's plan to abolish the Department of Education, to slash critical programs that help students like Title I, Pell Grants, financial aid, and programs that help kids learn, all to pay for a tax break for Trump's billionaire buddies and for friends of Elon Musk. Today, we've heard on committee alarming support from House Republicans for a national voucher scam that would pull money out of our public schools and hand it out in private contracts just to enrich their billionaire donors and their friends. And if you can't believe it, just take a look at what's happened here over the last couple of months. Musk has been using the federal government to get himself even more rich. He spent $277 million to elect Donald Trump, and since the election, he's become $154 billion richer. How is making billionaires richer while taking money away from our kids, how is that good for education? How's that good for student outcomes? How's that good for our community? How's that good for our taxpayers? It's good for no one but Trump's ego and for Musk's pocketbook. In places like Texas, I've seen rural Republicans speak out against these voucher scams because they know that pulling money out of our teachers and out of our public schools to hand over to unaccountable voucher schools is not empowering parents. It's taking money away from parents and handing it to these companies. For years, unaccountable, unregulated private schools have stolen public money through state voucher programs. We know some of those voucher schools took public funds for kids that weren't even intended or even going to those schools, weren't attending that school, embezzling millions of dollars. Elon Musk has used this kind of thing to his advantage for years. Remember that he is a government contractor himself who is taking untold amounts of money from a federal government that he's saying he's trying to make more efficient for somebody, but he's really trying to make it more efficient for himself. So what happens to our students that we want to learn when they have Title I funds cut away from about 60% of our public schools because of this House Republican plan to give a billionaire tax break? Who fills that gap? Is that our teachers spending their extra money that they barely have so that they can support our students? Is that local taxpayers that then have to pay to fill the gap, essentially backfilling the billionaire tax break that the Republican majority wants to pass? Are public schools that serve not just poor kids, but working class and middle class kids going to have to close? How does that improve learning for our students? So we must continue to fight, and I'm ready to fight on a bipartisan basis if we can see some bravery from some number of rural Republicans, just like I've seen in the last few years in places like Texas, who are willing to stand up to the grift, who are willing to stand up to the corruption, are willing to actually stand up for our students. We can improve our education system, and we can do it without stripping it for parts and selling it to the highest bidder. Trump, Musk, and their minions want to expand these voucher scams, not because they want to improve reading, not because they want to improve math, but because they want to improve their own wealth. They want to improve their own standing in the stock market. You know, this DOGE supposed agency, to me, is not the Department of Government Efficiency. It is the Department of Billionaire Corruption. And so from politically motivated firings this last week, to privatizing education, to eliminating whole departments against the Constitution, all so that private contractors can cash in, Trump and Musk are focused on one thing: enriching themselves, no matter what the cost to Americans. And I would hope to hear some House Republican spine against this spineless corruption. And unfortunately, what I've been hearing in committee today, Mr. Chairman, is people either being silent or going along with it, even though they know it's going to hurt our kids. Look at state after state after state where they've passed these voucher scams. Even Republicans that voted for it, you talk to them publicly and privately, they say this did not help. All it did was take money away from those schools that were asking for our help. Those people like us that are entrusted with these positions of power, we should be using it responsibly and not just be going along with the folks that already have more wealth than anybody's ever had in the history of this planet. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I recognize the chairman of the Workforce Protection Subcommittee, a new member of our committee as well, Mr. McKenzie from Pennsylvania.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to talk about the state of American education today. And I appreciate all of our testifiers sharing their experiences and their opinions with us. It's an important conversation we're having because when we look at higher education, for the years that I have been in public office, both at the state level and here at the federal level now, we have been touting and advocating choice for individuals in higher education. We have said that higher education is not only about four-year colleges, but we have said that there are so many other good options out there available to students, whether it's career and technical schools, going into the military, going straight into the workforce, but maybe doing continuing education in that particular job. Lots of choice at the higher education level. And what we have in America is we have the best system of higher education in the entire world because of that choice. That is a key element of our higher education system. But then when we talk about K through 12 education, for some reason, people want to oppose choice. They want to block choice. They want to hold people in positions where they are failing or they are not secure in their own school districts. And I want to give the example of a family that came to me to talk about their young daughter who's in high school. She's a low-income student, but she's in a very good school district. By all accounts, she should have been getting a good education there. But ultimately, she became the victim of bullying. And I'm not just talking about light bullying or, friendly jostling in the hallways. This was assault. I saw the videos. It was assault. And the school meted out the proper punishment, but ultimately, the perpetrator ended up back in the same school. And that student felt like she couldn't actually go to school and learn in a safe environment, even though it was a good school. Everybody in the community knows that that is a great school district, and she should be getting a good education. So the parents, they wanted to consider their different options. They looked at online schooling, and they said, well, that's not going to work for her. That school district did have an online option. But they said, we're two working parents. We're not going to be able to be there and supervise her on a day in and day out basis. She's not going to be able to learn in that kind of environment. We don't feel like she would be safe at home. So they looked at private schools. The price was too expensive. She didn't qualify for any scholarships. And so that option was closed to them as well. Because they weren't wealthy, they didn't have that choice. So that choice was closed out to them. Finally, there were charter schools in our community. They looked at the charter schools, but those seats were capped because people who wanted to oppose choice said that she could not get an additional seat in that school. And so ultimately, she was stuck in this situation where she was in a great school district where almost all of the other students are learning well, but she, as a victim of bullying, was stuck in an environment where she didn't feel safe, she wasn't ultimately going to school, she wasn't learning, and she was going to be on a path to failing that school year because of opposition to choice. So when people stand up here in opposition to choice, I want to recognize that there are real victims. When you oppose choice, there are people, there are individuals in those classrooms who are the victims of your opposition to choice. And so what we need to do is we need to talk about expanding choice for everybody so that every student has that opportunity to succeed. It shouldn't just be for the wealthy. It should be for every student, regardless of your race, regardless of your socioeconomic status. We want that choice for everybody. The public wants that choice. If you look at public opinion polling, overwhelmingly, it is in favor of school choice. That is the minority position to oppose choice in K through 12 education. That is a losing position. It is failing. It is not only failing our public, it is failing students like the one that I talked about today. So what I want to do is I want to raise up those voices of parents. I want to raise up the voices of advocates for school choice. Those aren't just buzzwords. There are real people and real lives attached to those movements. And so when we stand here and oppose, I want you to recognize that you're not just opposing choice. You're opposing that girl who is a victim of bullying. You are opposing her getting a better education, a better opportunity, and a better life. That's what you're opposing. So, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for the opportunity to have this discussion at the start of this session about the state of American education. We have lots of things that we can improve upon, but there are so many good things going on across this country that everybody should have access to. Every single person should have those same opportunities, not just the wealthy, which is what's going on in this country right now. But we can expand those opportunities to individuals that aren't wealthy and give them the same opportunities as the wealthy by giving them choice. So, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back to you, but I just want to say thank you for this opportunity, and I look forward to advancing legislation this session that will help every American student get the best opportunity and the best life that they can have. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. And now I recognize the chairman of the Early Childhood, Elementary, and Secondary Education Subcommittee and a passionate educator himself, Mr. Kiley from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've just received the latest test scores for students across this country, and they are absolutely alarming. What we see is that the trend continues to be one of decline, as you can see in this chart right here. The bottom part of the graph shows from 2013 to the present average scores in reading and in math, 4th and 8th grade. And then the top of the chart is particularly interesting because that shows the level of spending. The gray curve there is actually inflation. So you can see the spending line above that exceeds that. This is a steady growth in spending in real dollars that is proceeding in tandem with a steady decline in student achievement. So when we're talking about the reforms that are going to be considered by the President as well as by this committee, I certainly welcome any arguments against them that seek to identify what the implications of those reforms might be. But there are two responses that I think are wholly inadequate and are frankly the only responses we've really heard today from the other side of the dais. Number one is defending the status quo. This is the status quo. It is failure, continuing decline, a continual dimming of the prospects of America's young people, and a diminished capacity of America to lead the world. And the second response, also inadequate, is to say the solution is to just spend more money under the current system. Because as we can see, there has been an inverse relationship between spending and student achievement. So, Mr. Taylor, you mentioned this earlier, that simply spending more money doesn't necessarily help matters. Why do you believe that is, that we see this actually inverse correlation between spending and student achievement?
Well, because we ultimately refer to the K through 16 system as the people who produce the product that we employers buy. And we are increasingly seeing a lower quality product come out of the K through 16 system. So sadly, if we go back to the manufacturer, the K through 12 system ultimately manufactures the parents, but when you get into the system and you ask them and they say, well, we're spending more money on it, and we are telling them, but you're not giving us what we need. There's not enough volume, and the people who do come through often, your product often does not have the skills. And some of those are what you call soft skills, we call power skills. They don't know how to interact with other employees. They don't know how to work on teams. They don't know how to show up to work on time. There's a startling statistic that 20% of right now Gen Z parents are showing up to the interviews with them. Like, this is what's happening in the workplace. So we're saying, got it. You're spending a lot of money, but we're going to tell you on the other end of this that the product that you're receiving and delivering to us is suboptimal.
Right, and this is a characterization of the system as a whole. However, there are examples of schools and school systems that do quite well, that have an excellent educational product. And I'm very grateful that the chair has trusted me to lead the subcommittee that spans K-12 education as well as pre-K. And our overarching goal is going to be to look at how can we make it so these examples of really good schools and good school systems become the norm rather than the exception. And I think that there are principles that you can clearly identify with successful school systems. They allow flexibility in terms of how schools are operated. They demand accountability for actual outcomes. And then they provide parents and families with choices. Now, this, of course, is generally a characterization of how charter schools work. And charter schools have been very successful in many states across the country. So some of the priorities that our committee is going to focus on are, number one, the question of funding. How do we reimagine the role of the federal government in education, both when it comes to the bureaucracies that exist and how funding gets allocated? Number two is how can we support school choice in states and hold states accountable for policies that run against school choice, whether that be for charter schools or other forms of choice. Number three is how can we assist educators across the country in incorporating the very powerful personalized learning tools that advances in technology have made available. Number four, is examining how literacy is being taught across this country. There are still way too many districts and states that don't properly teach literacy. Number 5 is expanding the role of career education, which I know is a major priority of the chair. And number 6 is we need to look at the broken nature of special education funding, which is clearly inadequate for many districts, causing many districts to have to then dip into their general fund budget and isn't giving students with special needs and their families the support that they need. So I think that we have a tremendous opportunity, Mr. Chair, to catalyze absolutely amazing education reform across the country that will go a long way towards helping millions of kids and better preparing our country for global leadership in the future. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and we wish you well on those ideas and challenges. I now have the privilege of recognizing the Chairwoman Emeritus of this committee, Mrs. Fox from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank our witnesses for being here today. An important topic that you're dealing with. Dr. Cooper, the Parent Plus program has been regarded by many as the most predatory program in the federal student loan portfolio. Like Grad Plus, these loans have origination fees 4 times higher than the Stafford loans provided to students and a 9% interest rate, which is higher than many private student loans today. Moreover, Parent Plus loans have no limit on how much parents can borrow. Can you discuss the harms of Parent Plus as well as who is actually benefiting from these programs?
Thank you, Dr. Fox. The Parent Plus program is a predatory loan program. There's simply no other way to describe it. As you mentioned, the interest rates exceed 9%, the origination fees exceed 4%, and what's more, 20% of the parents who are getting Parent Plus loans foisted on them by colleges have an expected family contribution of 0, and what that means is that the federal government has determined that those parents can contribute nothing financially to their children's education, yet that same federal government is turning around and handing them an effective unlimited loan. Now, the ones who really benefit from the Parent Plus program are the colleges. Out of 5,000 colleges in the United States, just 500 of those use more than 80% of Parent Plus loans issued every year.
Let me do a follow-up on it. Last Congress, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle claimed that the reforms included in the College Cost Reduction Act, which sunset the Parent Plus program and reformed undergraduate lending to allow for more flexible borrowing limits, would, quote, cut off access to federal aid for half of students. From your expert perspective, is this actually true?
I think that reflects a misunderstanding of what the College Cost Reduction Act actually does. Only 10% of college students even use Parent Plus dollars, so it's impossible for half of students to be affected by that. And as a matter of fact, the Urban Institute found that over 90% of college students would be unaffected by the limits imposed in the College Cost Reduction Act. Who would be affected are the schools that are simply charging outrageous amounts and forcing the amount onto parents. And I would say not allowing those schools to foist unlimited loans onto parents is a feature, not a bug.
Well, a bit of hyperbole then there, right? Mr. Taylor, I know employers are thinking about student debt of their employees. We've been trying to address that issue here. I find it crazy that we allow people to borrow unlimited amounts through the Plus loan program. And worse, that we allow parents and even grandparents to borrow unlimited amounts when the federal government has determined they have no ability to pay them off, as Dr. Cooper just said. How do you feel about the Plus loan program, and do you think it's fair we lend the money out in this manner?
Dr. Fox, great to see you. We've been talking about this work a long time when it was at the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, because I think the Parent Plus loan, to use the term predatory, as that program currently works, is an understatement. We have seen, I understand access and the importance, particularly in the graduate school, of graduate plus type programs and wanting to help diversify our nation's workforce. The flip side is we know that on the employment side, people show up with $150,000 of debt and an undergraduate degree in art or communications or whatever it is. They simply can't focus on their work because they are working 2 jobs. It's not at all unusual to find someone who is under that kind of debt load from their undergraduate debt load, and my gosh, if they went to go get a master's degree, and those students simply can't perform. So they're working 40 hours with us, 30 hours in the evening with Uber, and then they come back to us and they are not their best. We are therefore not getting the return on our investment. We then fire them, and it's a vicious cycle. So it's not about, on the front end, well-intended, I'm certain, a policy, but in the end, what it has done is made it very difficult for employers to retain high-quality people and to see the productivity and efficiency that we need.
Thank you. Ms. Neely, 2 weeks ago I introduced H.R. 650, the Family Rights and Responsibilities Act. This legislation affirms the fundamental right that parents have to direct the education and upbringing of their children. Before interfering in parental educational choices, this bill requires the federal government to prove a compelling government interest. In your experience, does the Department of Education know a child's needs better than parents do?
Absolutely not. Parents know what's going on. They know what their children's needs are, what their children's education style are. And so to the extent where parents are able to determine an education institution or values that comport with what they want as opposed to what a bureaucrat in Washington wants, I think it's so much the better. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Now I recognize the conservative conscience from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Okay, a couple things. First of all, we're going to look at college because we can kind of cover everything today. At the University of Wisconsin in 1993, there were 26,000 full-time employees. Okay, 10 years later, the number of full-time employees went up from 26,000 to 33,000, but the number of faculty fell from about 7,200 to 5,800. So there was a dramatic cut in the number of faculty and a dramatic increase in the number of what I'll call administrative staff, something that wasn't teaching. Can you comment on that to me at all? I believe that's a nationwide trend, and that's why I want to bring it up, because we always talk about cost of education. It seems to me, I mean, I've talked to some people in the universities, they try to give me honest answers, but what's the deal on that? Somebody want to comment on this?
America's universities absolutely have a spending problem. U.S. universities and colleges spend more per student than any other large country in the developed world, and the University of Wisconsin is just one example.
Okay, well, that's good. Then we'll give you another question. Different countries start educating their students formally at different ages. And in America, they can be 5 years old, can be 6 years old, whatever. But there's no question that some countries, and I'm thinking countries like Finland or Singapore, they start a formal education later and thereby have a higher percentage of the children with their parents. Do you know why we are, or could you comment on this idea, the American idea of at cost, trying to get the children away from their parents earlier and earlier, which I hear a lot of some advocates for, as opposed to doing it in other countries where we have more confidence in the parents? Have some comment on that?
Is that an open question?
Yeah, well, I just want to comment on that. Why maybe we don't try to, since we're supposed to be a free country here, why don't we emulate countries like Israel? Emulate countries like Finland and Singapore, where, you know, the parents are primarily responsible for the children at a younger age.
Well, studies have shown that universal pre-K has boosted the ability of students to succeed in every context. If you invest in pre-K, you see the dividends returned at every other step of the education system. The other countries that you refer to that enable parents to stay with their children longer also have social supports for those families. They have a social safety net. They have other income that they provide for families in order to sustain their economic wherewithal when they are unable to work because they are taking care of their children.
Right. I'm familiar with the Brookings Institution study on Head Start, and it showed it wasn't that good. Do any of the other three of you have an opinion on getting kids in a formal setting or at a younger age?
I think the devil is in the details and how we execute on some of these things. The programs that we're seeing, the pervasive poisonous ideology in K-12 schools, if we start that even earlier at younger ages, 3, 4 years old, and we start to teach children to identify themselves and others on the basis of race, sex, or other immutable characteristics, I think it really continues to exploit the power dynamic between an adult and a child. And so to the extent where parents want to keep their children home, I think universal pre-K really removes that choice from parents, and that's something that I oppose.
What I oppose, though, is that what we know is that we have a problem keeping women in the workforce. They disproportionately are responsible for early child care. So to the extent that is an opportunity for a woman to go back to work who wants to go back to work, and this isn't exclusively women, but disproportionately women, we can do that by allowing them to ensure they have high quality care for their children that is also education.
Okay, well, thank you, my conservative witnesses. Next question I have for you. I was talking to some school superintendents recently, and they felt one of the reasons that they were struggling in school to provide a good education is a lot of the children come from difficult family backgrounds, and they felt there was a difference in the children who had a stable two-parent thing. Not that single parents do a fantastic job in many cases, fantastic job, but nevertheless they felt overall they were able to do a better job with the kids with both parents there. Could you comment on that? Is that we have a decline in America in the number of kids with both mom and dad at home? It seems to hurt the outcomes of the education system. Is that true?
Ian Rowe at the American Enterprise Institute has done terrific research on this, on the success sequence of that children obviously do better with two-parent households. And so to the extent where we see programs in school that discourage or that encourage the disruption
I'll
of
give you one more question here.
The gentleman's time has expired. We'll have to get the question answered in writing.
Well, I'll let you finish the question then, rather than jumping and
done.
giving her another. Finish your answer.
There are programs in school, right now it's Black Lives Matter at School Week, that prioritize the disruption of the Western prescribed nuclear family. That would be a two-parent household. It would be things like that. And so when students are learning and being taught lessons like that, I think it's a negative.
Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. And now I recognize my friend and the ranking member, Mr. Scott from Virginia, for his questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Neely, should parents always have the right to know things about their children, even if there's credible evidence that the child will be endangered if the parents get that information?
Education officials are mandatory reporters, and so if a school official believes that a child is in danger, they are obligated to report that to Child Protective Services. The CPS process is onerous, but there is due process built into it, and it's not a school official making a unilateral decision about a parent's fitness or not.
Should the parent always know?
A parent should know unless a school has determined that they are harmful, that they're at harm,
so
but that should be referred to CPS, not made unilaterally.
And should the parents should the parents have veto power over the curriculum?
Parents should have the choice to determine an educational setting that works for their child. So if a parent decides that a public school is not providing the values or the quality of education they want, then they should be allowed to find another alternative. Rich families can already, poor families may not.
So should parents in public school have veto power over the curriculum?
Parents should have access to their curriculum so they can know if this is a good fit for them or not. That is a problem, and accessing that information has been problematic from coast to coast.
So they shouldn't have veto power over
I didn't say that. I said they should at least have awareness of what that is.
I was asking the question. You didn't say, that's right. Should they have veto power over the curriculum?
I have never seen or heard of a school district where a parent has tried to exercise veto power over what a curriculum is. They would like access to it, and they have problems accessing that.
Is there evidence that increases in vouchers and private education leads to segregation?
Yes, there is evidence that the increase in voucher use, voucher scams, siphons money from the public education system and leaves some of the children who are most vulnerable without adequate resources. And we know that those children are disproportionately Black, Latino, low income, and people with learning disabilities.
And I think you referred to studies that showed that increased diversity in the school leads to increased student achievement?
Yes, there are studies that show that increases in diversity, equity, and inclusion create a more hospitable environment for learning, that they increase higher graduation rates, they improve critical thinking, better problem-solving ability, increase student satisfaction and motivation, improve self-confidence. There are a multitude of benefits to having a more inclusive learning environment.
Is there any evidence that public education is enhanced by school choice?
No, there is not. If you define school choice by the voucher scam programs that are being peddled, school choice exists within our public education school system. There are many opportunities for students to learn in different ways that can be accommodated by strengthening our public education school system without vouchers.
And what would the elimination of Title I do to equitable educational opportunities?
It would be absolutely devastating. There are many students who come from low-income families who rely on Title I funding, who rely on school lunch programs, free breakfast programs, and other ways to nourish them so that they can nourish their minds during the school day.
And so what problems do we need to actually address in public education?
We need to address real problems, not fictional or anecdotal issues that people are using to alarm parents across the country. What's really plaguing our schools is inequitable funding. There is not an argument that we necessarily need to pour more dollars. We need to take dollars away from things like funding prisons, where we fund prison populations at a rate of 3 times the amount that we fund per capita pupil investments.
That's a historically recent phenomenon.
Yes, and almost every person who spoke today lauding their education system is spending nearly 3 times the amount on prisoners than they are on actual students. We also know that racial segregation in our schools has actually increased in the past 30 years because of some of the reasons I mentioned earlier in my testimony.
Let me ask Mr. Taylor a question. Is there inherent value that cannot be instantaneously monetized in a liberal arts education?
Absolutely, yes.
And how do you improve access to that opportunity? Or should we just leave that opportunity to those that can afford it?
No, absolutely not. In fact, what we have found, especially at some of our more premium and premier employers, many of the high-end professional search firms, law firms, et cetera, is that we find people with degrees in anthropology, liberal arts, music, art, are incredibly critical thinkers. They learn to work with others, and they're very innovative and creative. So we see lots of advantage to the traditional undergraduate education, liberal education.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and now I would like to recognize the ranking member for his closing remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we've heard a lot about school choice. It's really a false choice. It just leads to separate and unequal schools. I thought we'd gotten away from that about 60, 70 years ago. We need to focus on improving education for the vast majority of the students who will be attending public schools. We need to also make sure that higher education, that people who have access to higher education, I think everybody can agree that it's not affordable right now. When people calculate, as Mr. Cooper, I think, suggested that people are calculating that's not worth it. Well, that's the solution to that would be not tell people not to go. The solution to that would be make it more affordable so that everybody can have that opportunity. And as Mr. Taylor mentioned, whether it's technically aligned with a particular job or not, because the liberal arts degree has inherent value. Now, there are job training programs. We've got programs in WIOA. We need to continue working on that, and I think we're on the right track on that. But access to higher education is going to be a challenge, and we just can't allow the present situation. 30, 40 years ago, if any college, virtually any college you wanted to go to, you could afford to go to. Pell Grant covered 80% of the cost of going to a state college. And with a summer job and 15 hours a week during the school year, you could work your way through college, come out with no debt. now, as it's been suggested, you work 40 hours a week and still can't come out of college without crushing debt. So we have challenges in higher education, but the numbers and results of where we are in public K through 12 obviously suggests that we need to make significant improvements, but dismantling the public education system is not the right course. So I thank you for holding the hearing, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and I thank the witnesses for what you've added to our hearing today, because it wouldn't be a hearing without witnesses, but credible witnesses who can speak from differing viewpoints, and I think that's the same with this committee here. I think I could safely assume that this committee, we agree on the basics of education and workforce. We have to have an educated workforce, and that comes from good educational institutions that are achieving, that are making it. I would think that the majority, I know for myself, I don't oppose public education. I don't want to decimate public education. My first 13 years of education was in public education. And a mother who was a public school teacher, and several aunts, and a daughter-in-law, and all in public education. But I think we also ought to be able to agree that we have problems. And those problems are opportunities. And at this point in time, I think we can agree that we're not achieving the excellence that we want to achieve. Can I safely say that? IDA funding isn't funded completely. We know that. The Department of Education is responsible for that. NAEP scores are going down. Anti-Semitism and anti-Americanism has put up its ugly head on our higher education institutions, some very elite higher education institutions as well. After spending $1 trillion since the inception of the Department of Education, we're still failing. And so we have the opportunity to at least work towards solutions, and that will cause creative tension and some heat and some disagreement. But I think it's important at this time that we jealously, and that's a word I want to use, steward our Article I authorities. But that also includes not fearing outside influences up to and including the President of the United States and whoever he has as advisors and assistants to find out what he would conclude is what we need. We can use that as a goad to do even better, whether we agree or disagree. I happen to agree, but this committee will work on finding solutions within our Article I authorities and powers and responsibilities, and we better not let down on that. Student, parents, teachers are our #1 priority in the educational system, correct? And then the workforce is what we've got to point our eyes toward. Whatever area of workforce there is, they need to be the best educated and prepared possible. Expressing our diversity best will be in the context of merit and excellence. And how we achieve that in the end is important. We have that opportunity on this committee to help determine where we go. Yes, we want more choice on our side of the aisle. And I'm not so sure that all of our colleagues on the other side would disagree with that. It's what choice it is, but we want more choice. And we want the same choice that billionaires already have. I think I'm right on that one. We throw out things that this is going to give choice to billionaires. No, they have it already. They have the money to pay for it. And they do that. And so we have to find a way to give choice to everybody as much as humanly possible. But I believe we can agree on our desire to improve educational opportunity for all. And that's where I want us to focus from this first hearing on. And I wait with expectation of how we can work together and how we can we can work in a creative tension to force our ideas, all of our ideas, to be better in the outcome of it all. So I think a lot, if not all, has been said today, and right now all have said it. So if there are no further business to be conducted here and without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
So I'm at PDE with Nikki. So just sitting, hanging, watching her. What about you? Yep, yep. I noticed.
What can you do?
Yeah, no, he definitely did.
What if you focus on
Yeah.
Did you get your question answered? Okay.
Here's where I know. I wasn't exactly sure what your question was, so I was spot on. You're good. So they. They're the cohorts setting aside qualifying graduate programs. They ask you for what? 5 or 6 cohorts, whatever. And for those people, you know, you're measuring. What I'm trying to figure out is, I know the qualifying graduates, they've got a couple more cohorts because they're trying to measure them longer. I'm trying to figure out what that number is. Let me 5, let me, you know what, that helps.
I do.
Yeah, that comes to the committee. I don't know why I can't find it. I don't know why I can't find it in our other stuff, but let's go back to one of our presentation things. That helped jog my memory. I think it might be 5 or 6. I think 6 maybe. I don't know. Like basic, you know, I think we passed it. Cohorts, right? Like, and it like blends them or something. Like, well, I think they just have to go further back to their journeys. Yeah. Like, if they're measuring in 6 years, they have to go further back. I don't know why. I searched for the word, but I was also writing it. Okay, blog post last time. But, I'm going to go back. I think there's a presentation where I actually featured on this, but it's so right, so like I just forgot. But I think I know what you're saying. Maybe that helps you find it. So I know we just if I'm thinking of the right component, right? When you discuss the language, I didn't like again. I wasn't exactly sure where you were pointing at last night, and so I was kind of like, okay, here are a couple of places I need to know. Yeah, and I even looked, I couldn't find it, but I looked in the department's Senate release what those qualifying grad programs were, like the initial list, and I think it was just the list of programs. Yeah, let me, there's a presentation I'll give you for asset. Yeah, and then I should be able to find it in our other material. I'm going to email to, I think, like 1 or 2 people that were at the department that are political. Like, you talking about it, just tell me. like, I know, like, we don't get along and everything. Just point me in the right direction. Like, it's your policy. I just want to know. So what do you think? I'm just, we're just thinking about all the conversations that I've had and about yourself and others and just what the, you know, like looking at formula and like thinking about things. So, you know, everything is very sensitive to say changes on the payment. So, blah, blah, blah. Real quickly, Senate Andy's job today. Where are we with the DWPA? Here's what I'm worried about. How shortfall. And that's the number one talking point that the Knights have against us on this.
and it's like now it's here, so it's like we didn't cover the normal range. So I know we gotta. That's just something we gotta talk about it.
So I mean, I think I know Collins and Markham.
So I mean, all like two
The increases from paying for still excluded for profits. It's really, I mean, I don't know that it's identical, but I read that.
It doesn't end up being super relevant.
Cassidy said he'd stay neutral.
Good. Well, he talked that last time. He ended up
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So cool. I graduated.
I've told it to you before, but we're going to have opposition talking points. Well, just get it fixed, okay?
Hi, Mr. Wilberg. I'm Kara Arundel with People Blog. Yeah, good to see you. Great conversation. Thank you.
I honestly think small organizations for us than everywhere else, but we have some.
let me just touch base.
To be honest, I don't know where they are because most of it is and not really.